Hello, my friend. Tonight we step back in time to a place where the air was thick with the scent of fresh bread, spices, and a much darker trade. It's the medieval market, a place of vibrant life, where sellers peddled goods from fabrics to food. But there was one thing that was all too common on display: female slaves. Women sold like commodities, often without a single ounce of control over their fate. Picture it now. Crowds of people, some eyeing exotic silks, others eyeing human beings. You probably won't survive this scene, and if you did, your life would be a shadow of what it could have been. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I always love hearing from where you're listening, so post your location and local time in the comments. Now, dim the lights, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Slave markets existed across medieval Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. These weren't just the stuff of dusty textbooks, no. These were thriving, brutal institutions. The goods in these markets were many, but the trade of women was perhaps the most grotesque and hidden. Unlike modern times, where we often imagine slaves as being all too visible in public movements, the medieval slave market was a place of quiet, invisible pain. You might have walked past a stall full of spices, unaware that right next to it was a group of women, shackled, eyes downcast, just waiting to be sold. These women were commodities, nothing more than property to the wealthy and powerful. In the medieval world, the role of women in the market wasn't just about labor, it was about control, power, and what their bodies could offer. A woman's value was determined not only by her ability to work, but by her ability to bear children. It sounds horrific, but in many ways, her reproductive capacity made her worth more than her labor. Slave women were often seen as objects to be bought, traded, and used as nothing more than vessels for their owner's gain. Historically, the market for these women didn't happen in some far-flung land, but in bustling city squares across Europe. Towns like Venice, Constantinople, and Cairo were major slave trade hubs. At the time, there were little to no laws regulating how women could be treated in these markets. It's chilling to think about how little control these women had over their lives. If you were sold into slavery, it was almost impossible to ever regain your freedom. Unlike in some ancient societies where you could eventually buy your way out of servitude, medieval slavery kept women tied to their masters, often for their entire lives. The sale of a female slave in these markets wasn't like purchasing a piece of cloth or pottery. It was a transaction that reflected ownership over a human being, over her life, her future, and even her body. She wasn't just a servant. She was something to be controlled, and this control extended far beyond the physical. It meant ownership of her thoughts, her actions, and most tragically, her very ability to make choices for herself. Historians still argue about how much this dehumanizing trade truly existed on the European continent compared to other parts of the world. Was slavery in Europe more about conquest and war? Or were women as slaves already part of a much darker, long-standing system? The truth is, while European enslavement of women may not have been as vast as other regions, it was no less damaging. These women were often taken from their homes, sold by their own families, or captured in raids. Their lives were sold to the highest bidder, and with no say in the matter, they were subjected to a life of labor, abuse, and, for many, the painful loss of identity. The truth is that the markets weren't just places for bartering grains and livestock, they were also venues for these women's pain to be sold to the highest bidder. Imagine for a moment the complexity of such a transaction. These women were bought, not for their skills, but for their very humanity. And in this, their suffering was rendered invisible to the crowds who gathered for daily commerce. You might think of these medieval slave markets as ancient relics, but in many ways they continue to shape the way we understand human trade today. The way women are trafficked, the way bodies are commodified, the way human suffering becomes an acceptable part of the economic engine. It all started long ago in these dark corners of history. In the end, the true horror of these medieval markets isn't just what happened there. It's how easily we forget that, in the span of human history, Slavery is just a page turned too quickly. These women, their lives, and their stories deserve to be remembered. Because tonight, we're not just uncovering the past, we're learning how much of it is still with us. As you begin to imagine the medieval marketplace, the sound of haggling merchants and the clinking of coins, you might picture the goods laid out in neat rows. Everything had its price, from livestock to fabrics to slaves. But the story of how women were commodified goes far deeper than you might expect. Slavery in the medieval world was not simply about controlling people's labor, it was about controlling life itself, especially women's lives. The markets were not just physical spaces, they were the very heartbeat of an economy built on the suffering and labor of others. You probably think that slavery was something that existed solely because of conquest and warfare, but that's not entirely accurate. Women weren't only captured in battles, they were born into the system. Many of them were the children of other slaves, living lives of servitude from the moment they drew their first breath. In the early days of medieval slavery, women could be traded, sold, and even given as dowries. Yes, a father might offer his daughter as a slave in exchange for a bride price, just as easily as one would sell a goat. Take a moment to think about that. The very concept of a woman's life being intertwined with her family's wealth. You might say it's a little unsettling to think that a father could give his daughter away in exchange for an object or money, but it happened more often than we care to admit. It wasn't just the poor who sold their daughters. Wealthier families, who considered their daughters little more than financial assets, might have been just as eager to trade them for profit or protection. It was a part of the social fabric, where women had very few options but to survive as someone's property. Historians still argue whether this was truly a universal practice across medieval Europe, or if it was more common in certain regions or social classes. Was the sale of women rooted in a system of patriarchy that ran deep throughout medieval society? Or was it an isolated practice that was just more common in times of war and crisis? Either way, it paints a grim picture of how society viewed women. They were an asset no different than cattle, grain, or gold. But it wasn't just the fathers making these decisions. Medieval slave markets were often places of intense political and religious power. A king could issue a decree to enslave entire villages, and the women of those villages would be shipped off to faraway markets. The church, too, had its hand in the trade, even if it wasn't always openly acknowledged. In many cases, the church considered women to be the property of their husbands or of the church itself. The irony is hard to ignore. While religious leaders preached the sanctity of human life, many also turned a blind eye to the sale and ownership of women as mere objects. In fact, some women were not even captured, they were simply taken from the life they knew. Imagine being a peasant woman, living in a small village. One day, a band of raiders comes through and sweeps up the young, the strong, and the vulnerable. In a single day, your life changes forever. From the familiar sounds of village life, you are now in the hands of foreign traders. You're a piece of property now, your value determined by what you can do for your captors. There's no recourse, no rescue, no hope of returning to the life you knew. It's a tragic fate that many women faced, and it's one that still lingers in history. Historians still debate whether the medieval period, particularly in the 11th and 12th centuries, was an especially active time for slave trading, or whether the practice was already well established. Some argue that slavery grew in scope after the fall of the Roman Empire, while others insist that it was a much older practice. Regardless, what we do know is that women were among the most valuable, often the most expendable commodity on the market. Slavery wasn't just a consequence of war, it was part of the cultural fabric of many regions. As you sit with these images in your mind, consider how women were not just sold for their labor but for their very existence. The medieval world might seem far removed from us now, but its legacy, especially in the way it treated women, still echoes. Women were valued for their ability to perform tasks that others couldn't or wouldn't do, but also for what they could offer beyond their work: children, sex, and submission. These are hard truths, but they need to be told. In the market, Women weren't viewed as individuals with hopes or desires, they were seen only as vessels, bodies to be exploited and traded. It's no surprise that many of them didn't survive long after being sold. Illness, exhaustion, and abuse took their toll. Their lives were a commodity in the truest sense of the word. A woman's value was dictated by how much she could endure, how much labor she could produce, and how much she could bear in terms of pain. Now, imagine you're in the midst of one of these medieval markets. You're walking through rows of stalls filled with all kinds of goods, fruit, textiles, spices, livestock, and then, without warning, you're hit with a sight that seems out of place. Women, standing silently, waiting to be sold. They're not in chains yet, but their faces speak of fear, of helplessness. These women are being traded like cattle, their lives hanging in the balance of the highest bidder. You might think this is a relic of ancient history, but in reality this is a harsh truth that persisted much longer than you might imagine. One of the strangest aspects of the slave markets was the way women were not just bought and sold for physical labor, but for their ability to bear children. It's disturbing, but it was an undeniable fact of life in many parts of the world. A woman's worth in the market often had little to do with her skills. Instead, it was her potential to bear heirs, to provide more labor through her children, that made her a highly sought-after commodity. What's even more troubling is how this idea was deeply rooted in medieval society. Men were the ones in charge, and their treatment of women reflected this ownership was the key. In fact, we know that some of these women were sold for purposes beyond labor. Imagine being sold into servitude not for the work you could do, but for the children you could produce. Your life, your entire identity, would be wrapped up in your ability to reproduce. It's chilling to think of how many women were auctioned with no say in the matter. They didn't have the luxury of deciding their fate or their future. They were simply placed in the hands of whoever could afford them. And it wasn't just women from poor backgrounds who faced this fate. In fact, some of the most disturbing stories come from women of noble birth. These women, born into families of wealth and power, were often married off or given as gifts in exchange for political power or wealth. Imagine this: a woman, perhaps the daughter of a lord, reduced to nothing more than a pawn in a larger game. Her life wasn't her own, and she wasn't seen as an individual but as a means of securing power for others. While it's easy to think of medieval slavery as something confined to the margins of society, this practice reached the highest echelons of power. Even kings and nobles were involved in the trade, using women as tools for strengthening political alliances or increasing wealth. When you look at this, it becomes clear that medieval slavery wasn't just about conquest, it was also about the consolidation of power and wealth through the control of human lives. These were not the days of distant, far-off lands where slavery was accepted. No, this was a reality for many, right at the heart of Europe, where it became a key component of the social fabric. Some scholars argue that the medieval period, particularly during the rise of feudalism, was the high point of slavery. Others suggest that slavery existed throughout the early Middle Ages, but it was the structures of the feudal system that made the trade of human beings more formalized. Regardless of where scholars land on the timeline, one thing is certain: the practice of selling women, using them as bargaining chips for power, wealth, and status, was not only common, it was institutionalized. As we reflect on this, think about the future of these women. Their children, born into slavery, would face the same fate generation after generation. And this wasn't just a short-lived period of history. These practices lasted centuries, leaving an indelible mark on the course of history. What was passed down through generations wasn't just the labor of these women, but also the silence of their suffering, which too often went unnoticed by the world around them. What's even more astonishing is how little was said about these women in the historical records. They were often reduced to mere footnotes in a history that focused on the grandeur of kings, the achievements of generals, and the wars fought over territory. Their voices were silenced by time, their stories lost in the noise of a world obsessed with power. It's only now that we can look back and begin to truly understand the horror of what these women went through, and how their lives were exploited in ways that were both shocking and brutal. Picture this. It's a bustling medieval marketplace, where traders are shouting to sell their goods, but instead of browsing the usual wares, a crowd gathers around a human auction. Women stand before them, their eyes downcast, waiting to be sold. The price tags? Their lives. For many of these women, this was the only option, a life of servitude, as mere objects to be traded in exchange for wealth or power. But there's a darker reality behind this scene. This wasn't just about work. It was about something more sinister: control. You might think that slavery was purely a byproduct of war or conquest, but it wasn't always that simple. Women were often sold in these markets not because they were prisoners of war, but because they were considered commodities. In some cases, entire families were sold, but women and children were particularly vulnerable. You see, women's value wasn't just tied to their labor, it was tied to their ability to bear children. The more children they could produce, the higher their value. And if you were fortunate enough to be young, healthy, and fertile, you might fetch a much higher price than an older woman. Imagine standing in line, waiting for your turn to be auctioned off. Your worth is measured by your age, your looks, and your ability to bear children. You are nothing more than a breeding vessel, your entire existence reduced to these factors. It's a harrowing thought, isn't it? The commodification of women was so normalized that it became a cornerstone of the medieval slave trade. This wasn't just about providing labor, this was about perpetuating a cycle of exploitation and dehumanization. But this exploitation went beyond the market itself. The women who were bought didn't always work in the homes of the rich. Many of them ended up in brothels, where their worth wasn't measured by the work they could do but by how much pleasure they could provide for their masters or clients. In some areas, brothels were run like slave markets, with women being sold for their sexual services. Imagine being a young woman, sold into a brothel with no choice in the matter. You would work long hours, be subjected to the whims of those who paid for your services, and have little to no control over your own body. Historians are still unsure whether brothels were the most common destination for enslaved women or whether they were simply one part of the wider network of exploitation. But what's clear is that women were often denied the possibility of freedom, and if they did gain their freedom, it was usually because of their ability to purchase it, something most slaves didn't have the means to do. While it's easy to think of slavery as a distant concept, the reality is that the exploitation of women in medieval times set the stage for many of the patterns we see in modern-day human trafficking. The idea that women's bodies were objects to be bought, sold, and used for pleasure or labor has not disappeared, it's simply evolved. This is the darker side of medieval slavery that is still relevant today. Now, imagine the powerlessness these women must have felt. No voice, no choice, no control. Their lives were dictated by the whims of their masters, and their only option was to endure. The idea of escape was nearly impossible. Some women might have tried to flee, but without resources or support, their chances of surviving outside the market were slim. Even if they were lucky enough to escape, they were often hunted down and returned to their masters, sometimes facing even harsher punishment for their attempt at freedom. This was the grim reality of life for enslaved women in medieval markets. A life with no hope, no future, just survival. Historians still debate whether any forms of resistance or rebellion were prevalent among the enslaved women. Some suggest that there were subtle acts of defiance, such as avoiding work or sabotaging tasks, but others argue that the fear of punishment was too great for any widespread rebellion to occur. Still, there are examples of women running away, of attempting to carve out lives beyond the market, though such stories are rare and often lost to history. What remains clear, though, is the brutal cycle that enslaved women were caught in. Whether they worked in homes, brothels, or as laborers on farms, their lives were marked by exploitation. The medieval world might seem far removed from our modern one, but in reality, many of the patterns that emerged during this dark period continue to shape our world today. Now, imagine he's stepping into a medieval slave market. The atmosphere is thick with the smell of sweat, leather, and the distant echoes of bargaining. But there's one thing that stands out more than anything else: the prices. Women, standing in rows, eyes lowered, faces marked with fear, are auctioned off like livestock. But their worth isn't just in what they can do, it's in their bodies, their ability to endure, and, most disturbingly, their potential to reproduce. Their value was defined not by their skills or intelligence, but by what they could give: children, labor, and most horrifyingly, submission. The act of purchasing a slave in the medieval world wasn't just about gaining a worker, it was about gaining control over another human being's entire existence. In some ways, this can feel almost unimaginable today, but it was a reality that many women in medieval markets had to face. Whether it was a wealthy merchant, a nobleman, or a king, the slave market served as a place where human beings were reduced to prices, their futures tied to the whims of the highest bidder. Women were often bought as a status symbol, as a means to increase wealth or power, and sometimes as part of alliances or political negotiations. But as uncomfortable as it may be to admit, women were also bought simply for their ability to bear children. This is where the darker, more sinister side of medieval slavery becomes apparent. A woman's reproductive potential was her true value. If a young woman was sold into slavery, she wasn't just expected to work, she was expected to produce offspring, thereby increasing her owner's wealth through new generations of laborers. In the most brutal sense, women became human breeding machines. Their existence was bound to their capacity to reproduce, their bodies seen as property to be exploited for as long as they were useful. In fact, some medieval slave owners believed that the more children a slave woman had, the greater her value. A woman who produced multiple children could be worth far more than one who didn't, despite the fact that her work was just as labor-intensive. This disturbing view of women was rooted deeply in medieval society, where a woman's worth was often defined by what she could contribute to the family or the household, not by who she was as an individual. And, in many ways, the economic structures of the time reflected this attitude. Women were reduced to vessels, mere tools for economic gain. Historians have long debated whether this view was unique to the medieval period, or whether it was common across other historical periods as well. Some argue that the use of women's bodies in this way was a direct result of the feudal system, where land and wealth were passed through bloodlines. In this system, women were often seen as extensions of the family they were born into, and their primary role was to maintain or improve their family's standing. Others contend that this exploitation was merely an extension of earlier practices, seen in the ancient civilizations of Greece, Rome, and beyond. Despite the complexities of these historical debates, one thing is clear: women in the medieval slave market were seen as valuable only insofar as they could provide something to their owners, whether that was labor, children, or sexual services. Their personal needs, desires, and dreams were ignored, erased by a society that saw them as little more than property. But how did this process actually play out? Imagine the auction. A young woman, standing in the center, her fate sealed by the highest bidder. The crowd watches, murmurs buzzing around the market as the bidding begins. What was the price of a human being? A woman, reduced to nothing more than a transaction. A woman's worth was measured in coin, not in her potential, her intelligence, or her spirit. At this moment, her future is determined by the man with the most money, and she becomes a mere object, a piece of property, bound to serve. As we sit with this uncomfortable image, it's essential to remember that these women weren't always passive victims. Some managed to carve out a form of survival in a world that offered them few choices. Some women, after being sold into slavery, found ways to exert their own small amount of agency. Others fought back, sometimes quietly, sometimes in more direct ways. But for the vast majority, the slave market was a place where their worth, their dignity, and their autonomy were stripped away. Historians continue to argue over how much agency enslaved women had in these settings. Some point to instances of women managing to manipulate their owners or find ways to escape, while others emphasize how widespread and systematic the oppression was. What is evident, however, is that the slave market was an institution designed to strip away individuality and to make a woman nothing more than a means to an end. In the end, the concept of buying and selling women in the medieval world wasn't simply about economics, it was about control. A woman's body was seen as something that could be controlled, dominated, and exploited. The marketplace became a reflection of a world where women were not seen as individuals but as tools to be used, discarded, and traded at will. Let's pause for a moment and try to put ourselves in the shoes of a woman caught in this harsh world. Imagine you've been taken from your home, sold into slavery, and now find yourself in a crowded medieval market, awaiting the highest bidder. Your fate is sealed by the price someone is willing to pay for you, and there's no way out. But the reality of being a female slave in the medieval world wasn't just about physical labor, it was about gender and the added layer of exploitation that came with being a woman in a patriarchal society. You might think, sure, slaves were oppressed, but men and women faced similar challenges. But there's a stark difference between how male and female slaves were treated. The truth is, the oppression of women was much more complex. Women weren't just slaves in the traditional sense, they were often subjected to additional layers of exploitation, including sexual violence, that male slaves didn't face to the same extent. A woman's worth wasn't only determined by her ability to work, it was defined by her body and her ability to bear children. In the medieval market, a woman's reproductive capacity was not just valued, it was demanded. Masters didn't just want a hard-working slave, they wanted a slave who could produce offspring, thus ensuring a new generation of laborers who could also be controlled and exploited. This is one of the most uncomfortable realities of medieval slavery. The constant pressure for women to bear children, and the idea that their value was closely tied to their fertility. Think about this for a moment. Your worth is no longer based on your skill, your mind, or your abilities. It's determined solely by your body's ability to produce new life. It's a chilling thought, isn't it? Women were expected to work hard, and if they did well enough, they might be rewarded with better treatment, but ultimately, their worth was always tied to their reproductive ability. Even if they didn't survive long enough to give birth, their lives still served a purpose, as commodities to be traded for profit. This is the tragic reality that enslaved women faced in medieval markets. Historians still debate how prevalent this emphasis on reproduction was in different regions and time periods. Some argue that in certain areas of medieval Europe, a woman's ability to bear children was considered the most important factor in her value. Others suggest that the importance of childbirth was exaggerated in the historical records, but it's hard to deny that reproduction was a key aspect of slavery for women during this time. Regardless of the nuances of these historical debates, the fundamental truth remains. Women in the medieval slave markets were seen not as people, but as tools to be used for the benefit of their owners. This idea of using women's bodies to secure wealth and power was deeply ingrained in medieval society. It wasn't just about individual slave owners exploiting women for personal gain. It was also about a larger social structure that perpetuated the idea that women were less valuable than men and that their bodies could be used for whatever purpose their owners saw fit. In many ways, this system mirrored broader societal views about women, where their worth was defined by their ability to serve and reproduce, rather than by their intellect, creativity, or independence. The reality of life for enslaved women was harsh, and for many, escape was nothing more than a dream. Fleeing the market wasn't a viable option for most. Women who attempted to run away were often caught and returned to their masters, sometimes with even harsher punishment. The brutal truth was that freedom was almost impossible to attain for an enslaved woman, and even if they were lucky enough to find temporary refuge, they faced the constant threat of being captured and brought back to the market. But it wasn't all hopeless. Some women did find ways to resist, even if it was in small, quiet ways. A woman might sabotage her work or slow down her tasks, not out of defiance, but as a way of asserting control over her own life. Others might have used their charm or wits to gain favor with their masters, giving them some degree of leverage over their situation. Still, These instances of resistance were the exception rather than the rule. The overwhelming reality was that most enslaved women had little to no control over their lives, their bodies, or their future. As we think about the brutal realities of this time, it's crucial to understand that these women were not just victims, they were survivors. They survived in a world that dehumanized them, in a system that saw them as little more than property. And while their stories have often been lost to history, the fact that we are talking about them now is a small victory in itself. Their lives may have been erased from the records, but their suffering, their strength, and their resilience are not forgotten. Historians still struggle with how to tell the stories of these women, given the lack of direct records about their lives. Their voices were drowned out by the louder, more powerful voices of the men who controlled their fates. But the truth is that these women were not passive victims. They had their own ways of fighting back, surviving, and even finding small pockets of power in a world designed to strip them of everything. By now, you might be starting to feel the weight of the world these women lived in. Picture again that medieval marketplace, where human lives are traded like commodities, where the price of a woman is determined by her age, her looks, and her reproductive potential. But the truth of the medieval slave market goes beyond these transactional aspects. The emotional and psychological toll of being sold into slavery is something we can only begin to imagine, as the women in these markets were not only stripped of their freedom but of their identities as well. When a woman was sold into slavery, it wasn't just her physical body that was taken, it was her sense of self, her individuality, and her personal history. She became a piece of property, no longer allowed to make decisions about her own life. If she had a family, they were often lost to her forever. The connections she once had were severed by the harsh realities of the market. She was no longer a daughter, a sister, or a mother. She was simply a slave, a tool to be used for labor or reproduction. Imagine the emotional devastation of being separated from everyone and everything you've ever known, forced to live a life where every move you make is dictated by someone else. As hard as it may be to imagine, this was a reality for many women in the medieval slave markets. And though some historians have argued that these women must have found ways to assert some degree of autonomy or resistance, the fact remains that most were powerless. The system was set up to break them down, to erase their identities and strip them of any sense of control over their own lives. They were nothing more than property, traded between hands like any other object in the market. However, while much of their personal lives were erased, the legacy of these women is more complex than simply being forgotten. In fact, it's their invisibility that speaks volumes. The lack of historical records about the individual experiences of enslaved women is not due to their lack of importance. It's due to the system that made their lives invisible. They were removed from the historical narrative, ignored by the chroniclers of the time, and reduced to mere statistics. But despite this, their stories have survived in the spaces between the lines of history, in the ways that their lives shaped the very structures of society. Some historians have argued that the very absence of records about these women's lives points to their significance. After all, if they were as insignificant as history suggests, why would their suffering be systematically erased? Why would their voices be silenced so thoroughly? The truth is that these women's lives mattered more than the history books have ever let on. They were not simply casualties of a brutal system, they were the foundation of it, supporting the weight of an entire economy, an entire society that relied on their exploitation. Yet, the painful truth remains that most of the individual stories of these women were lost to time. What we do know, however, is that these women were among the first to experience the brutal realities of being sold for profit in a system that viewed them as less than human. They endured hardships that no one should ever have to face, and they did so in silence, often without the hope of ever being heard. They were forgotten, but not in the way history would like to pretend. They were erased, hidden behind the powerful narratives of kings, warriors, and nobles who shaped the world's history. Historians still argue about whether the medieval period marked the peak of slavery, or if earlier societies were even more brutal in their treatment of slaves. Some suggest that the feudal system allowed for greater exploitation of women, while others argue that earlier systems were just as dehumanizing, though different in their structure. What's clear, however, is that the way society viewed women, and especially enslaved women, was deeply ingrained in the cultural fabric of the time. Women were objects, not people. They were tools for reproduction, labor, and pleasure, with no control over their own destinies. Despite all this, the legacy of these women is not one of complete erasure. Through historical research, we're able to uncover their stories, piece by piece, and understand the ways in which they helped shape the medieval world. Their suffering, though largely forgotten, still resonates through the centuries. And perhaps the greatest injustice of all is how these women, who bore the brunt of such brutality, were denied even the dignity of being remembered as individuals. Instead, they were erased from history, their names and stories lost to time. As we reflect on their lives, it's important to remember that their suffering wasn't just personal, it was part of a larger system that exploited countless people for the benefit of the powerful. And while history may have forgotten their names, their legacy lives on in the lessons we can learn from their pain. The invisible women of the medieval slave markets may have been forgotten, but their impact on the world is undeniable. Now that we've walked through the grim reality of the medieval slave markets, it's time to zoom out and see the bigger picture. These markets didn't just exist in isolation, they were part of a much larger system that affected every aspect of medieval society. The commodification of women was not just something that happened at the market, it was woven into the very fabric of society. Slavery, particularly of women, was an integral part of the medieval economy, politics, and social structure. Imagine a world where wealth and power were built on the backs of the oppressed. In the medieval period, a noble's wealth wasn't necessarily determined by how many fields he owned or how much livestock he had. It was also determined by how many slaves he could acquire. And women, particularly those who could bear children, were seen as one of the most valuable types of slaves. Their reproductive value made them highly prized, and they were often used as pawns in the social and political games of the wealthy. Their bodies were not just a source of labor, they were a source of power. Their ability to bear children meant more workers for the future, more labor for the estate, and ultimately, more wealth. This wasn't just a local phenomenon. The slave trade was a network that spanned across Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. The women who were sold in the medieval markets didn't just come from the local peasantry, they were captured in raids, bought from foreign traders, and often transported across great distances. Slavery was not just a domestic issue, it was a global one. In some cases, women were taken from as far away as Eastern Europe, and some were even brought to the markets from North Africa. The reach of the slave trade was vast, and women were at its center. Some argue that the widespread nature of the medieval slave market and its reliance on female slaves was a result of the feudal system. Under feudalism, the hierarchy of lords and vassals was deeply entrenched, and women were often treated as extensions of the land or property. The idea of ownership was central to medieval life, and women, especially those in the slave markets, were no different. Their value was tied to their ability to work, to produce children, and to increase the wealth and power of those who owned them. But there's also another layer to this. While men might have been bought and sold as laborers or soldiers, women were seen as more than just workers. They were also seen as sources of pleasure, reproduction, and social status. The medieval system didn't just exploit women for their labor, it exploited them for their very existence as female bodies. The idea of owning a woman wasn't just about ensuring that the household had enough workers, it was also about maintaining a sense of power and control, both over the woman herself and over the entire social structure. Some historians have suggested that the focus on female slaves in the medieval period is partly tied to the patriarchal systems that were in place. In a world where men controlled most aspects of life, women were often relegated to a subservient role. They were considered property to be controlled, bought, and sold, and this view of women as inferior was reinforced by the Church, which supported the patriarchal status quo. Religion played a key role in justifying the treatment of women as property. While the Church preached the sanctity of life, It also turned a blind eye to the suffering of those women who were seen as less than human. This intersection of power, gender, and economics is something that historians still struggle to fully unpack. It's hard to ignore the ways in which the medieval system, with its reliance on slavery, shaped our understanding of gender roles and social structure. Many scholars have explored how these medieval practices influenced later systems of slavery, both in the colonial world and in more modern times. The brutal treatment of women in the medieval markets didn't just disappear after the Middle Ages, it was a legacy that lived on, informing later forms of oppression. But the story doesn't end there. While we've mostly focused on the suffering, it's essential to recognize that these women, despite their horrific circumstances, didn't fade into complete obscurity. Though their voices were silenced, their presence in history continues to echo through the centuries. In the accounts of the markets, in the remnants of their lives that historians have pieced together, there's a story of resilience, of survival, and of defiance, even in the most harrowing of circumstances. Historians debate whether these women ever had moments of rebellion, whether they found ways to exert control over their situations, or if their lives were entirely defined by submission. Some point to examples of women who fought back in small, subtle ways, perhaps by refusing to perform certain tasks, sabotaging their work, or even using their intelligence to gain favor with their owners. But even in these small acts of resistance, we see a glimpse of the strength and resilience that these women must have had, even in the face of overwhelming oppression. And this is where the true tragedy lies, in the silence of these women, in the erasure of their stories. The fact that we know so little about their individual lives, about their hopes, dreams, and desires, speaks volumes about the power structures that kept them hidden. But tonight, we're remembering them, bringing their stories into the light, acknowledging their suffering, and honoring their strength. By now, the shadows of the medieval slave market should feel as oppressive as the very air those women breathed. It's hard to imagine the psychological toll of being sold, day after day, in a public market, your worth determined by your age, your body, and your ability to reproduce. But beyond the obvious exploitation, there's a deeper layer to explore: the psychological conditioning that both enslaved women and their masters underwent. After all, an entire society had to be complicit in the system for it to survive for as long as it did. Imagine the internalized beliefs that shaped medieval society's view of women. The idea that women were inherently inferior, that their worth was tied to their ability to bear children and perform labor, was embedded in the very fabric of the time. These beliefs didn't just affect the women who were enslaved, they affected everyone. Those who owned slaves saw it as a normal, even necessary part of life. The women they bought and sold were little more than extensions of their wealth, tools to be used for personal gain. The notion of owning a person, particularly a woman, became so deeply ingrained that it was rarely questioned by the social elite. This mindset didn't just end with the transaction. Once a woman was bought and sold, her life became an exercise in subjugation. She was taught to believe that she was worth only what her master decided she was worth. She was a body to be exploited, a source of labor, and a potential mother for future generations of workers. The concept of freedom, of choice, of self-determination was foreign to her. If she ever dared to dream of escaping, the brutal reality of the system would quickly crush those hopes. Escape wasn't just a physical act, it was an entire mental shift, one that was nearly impossible in a world where everything she knew, from her value to her body, was determined by someone else. Now, let's turn the lens and think about the men involved in this system, the slave owners, traders, and those who profited from the women's bodies. These men weren't necessarily evil masterminds, though some were. They were products of a society that told them this exploitation was not only acceptable, but necessary for their success. Their treatment of women was not just about cruelty, it was about control. They were taught to see women as commodities, as resources to be used, as bodies to be dominated. For them, this was an acceptable and expected part of their power structure. Many of these men likely never questioned the system, perhaps because it benefited them so greatly. They bought and sold women as casually as they bought land or livestock. The act of selling a woman wasn't personal, it was business. Their treatment of women was based on the societal norms of the time, norms that justified the exploitation of women not as an anomaly, but as a part of everyday life. And perhaps the most chilling part of this is that, for the wealthy and powerful, there was nothing radical or revolutionary about slavery. It was the natural order of things. Historians still argue whether this systemic exploitation was so deeply embedded in medieval society that it was seen as unchangeable. Some argue that the idea of individual rights and freedoms was simply unheard of for the lower classes. To others, the focus on religious teachings and the natural order reinforced the idea that women were meant to serve. The Church, which preached compassion, also silently reinforced the social and economic structures that allowed slavery to thrive. So, while there may have been a few dissenting voices, the majority of medieval society accepted these brutal practices without question. But while we focus on the system of exploitation, it's crucial to remember that resistance wasn't entirely absent. While the majority of women likely felt powerless, history also tells us of a few notable figures who challenged the system. Some women escaped their captors, some fought for their freedom, and some found subtle ways to resist. These acts of resistance weren't always grand revolutions, but they were rebellions nonetheless. Even in a world as oppressive as this, moments of resistance existed. Think about how much the fear of rebellion must have shaped the minds of slave owners. They would have had to be constantly vigilant, always worried that their slaves might rise up against them. The fear of revolt, though rare, was always present. For the women, though, it was a different kind of fear. They feared not just physical punishment, but the loss of their very sense of self. Every day was a battle to hold on to any shred of identity, any flicker of autonomy. Even in their silence, their suffering, and their obedience, there was resistance in the form of survival. Historians still debate the nature of this resistance, arguing whether it was more about small acts of defiance or whether any real rebellions ever occurred among the enslaved women. Some suggest that many women found ways to subtly subvert the system, sabotaging their work or withholding their labor in small, unnoticeable ways. Others believe that the system was so rigid, so oppressive, that true rebellion was impossible without external support. What is clear, however, is that despite the odds, some women found ways to resist. They resisted with their actions, with their silence, with their endurance. But we must also ask, what does this mean for us today? What lessons can we learn from the women of the medieval slave markets, whose stories have been hidden for centuries? The most significant takeaway is that no system of oppression can ever completely erase the humanity of those it seeks to control. These women, despite being stripped of their rights, their freedom, and their dignity, remained human. They survived, and in doing so, they left a legacy that continues to echo through time. Though their names may have been forgotten, their strength, their pain, and their resistance are not. Now that we've delved deep into the chilling realities of the medieval slave markets, it's time to shift our gaze to the more hidden aspects of this system, the ways in which women were not only bought and sold, but also commodified in ways that extended far beyond their physical labor. The act of purchasing a woman wasn't simply about acquiring a servant, it was about controlling the very core of her being, her body, her fertility, and her future. Imagine this. You are a woman, standing in a line with other slaves, your future tied to the whims of whoever can afford you. Your master is not just buying your labor, he is buying control over your ability to reproduce. The idea that women were seen as nothing more than vessels for childbirth, especially in the medieval slave market, is deeply disturbing. Yet it was a reality for many. These women were considered far more valuable if they could bear children, particularly male heirs who could then grow up to work for their masters. A woman's reproductive capacity wasn't just a biological fact, it was a commodity in a brutal economy. But let's take a moment to think about how the very concept of value played into this. In the medieval world, a woman's worth wasn't based on her intellect, her abilities, or her character. It was based entirely on her physical traits. How young she looked, how healthy she appeared, and how capable she was of bearing children all dictated how much she could fetch in the market. For many, their only purpose was to produce more slaves or to serve in the households of the wealthy, working from sunrise to sunset without a single moment of reprieve. The transaction itself was devoid of empathy or recognition of the woman's humanity. This reduced view of women wasn't just confined to the market. It seeped into every facet of medieval life, where the commodification of women was justified by religious doctrine, social expectations, and political structures. The Church, despite its supposed teachings of compassion and respect for human life, often turned a blind eye to the reality of slavery, particularly when it came to women. While the Church spoke of protecting the vulnerable, it simultaneously allowed the system of slavery to flourish. The hypocrisy of this, where women were sold as property under the guise of religion, is both chilling and telling. Interestingly, some scholars argue that the role of the Church in the slave trade is one of the most overlooked aspects of medieval slavery. While the Church often denounced the abuse of slaves, it also didn't take substantial action to stop the practice. In fact, many religious leaders were complicit in supporting a system where women were seen as tools to further political and economic interests. And what's even more troubling is that the Church's doctrines about the role of women in society further reinforced the idea that women were inferior beings whose worth was defined by their ability to serve and procreate. This cycle of exploitation was both religiously sanctioned and deeply embedded in medieval culture. While we focus on the Church and its influence, we can't ignore how this treatment of women as property was embedded in the laws of the time. In many parts of medieval Europe, a woman's legal status was tied directly to her father or husband. She had few, if any, rights to her own property, body, or future. Her very identity was dependent on the men who owned her, and in the case of enslaved women, this ownership was literal. Women had no legal recourse, and if they were mistreated or abused, there was little hope for justice. The laws of the time didn't protect women, they reinforced their status as property to be bought, sold, and discarded as the market saw fit. But let's not forget the silent rebellion that lived within these women. While they may have had little power in the grand scheme of things, many found ways to resist, even in the smallest of actions. A woman could slow down her work, act in subtle defiance, or even use her position to manipulate those around her. These were small acts, often unrecorded, but they represented a resistance to the system that sought to control them. This small-scale defiance didn't topple the system, but it was a form of survival, a way for women to hold on to some semblance of autonomy in a world that denied them nearly everything. Historians have long debated whether such acts of resistance were enough to spark any meaningful change in the structure of medieval slavery. Some believe that even small rebellions had ripple effects that helped sow the seeds of larger social movements. Others argue that the system was so entrenched that resistance was futile, and any attempts were quickly crushed. But one thing is certain: the medieval slave markets were not simply places of transaction, they were places of pain, endurance, and quiet defiance. Looking at the broader picture, the lasting impact of this system can still be felt today. The commodification of women in medieval slavery has echoes in the modern world. Though slavery as we know it may have been abolished in most parts of the world, the idea that women's bodies are property, that their worth is tied to their appearance or ability to bear children, is still alive and well. This historical legacy of control, exploitation, and dehumanization continues to manifest in the ways that women are trafficked, abused, and treated as objects for profit. We may think that this is all in the past, but the echoes of the medieval slave market live on. The commodification of women, the idea that their value is tied to their ability to serve or produce, still influences how women are treated in many parts of the world. This is why it's so important to remember these women, to acknowledge their suffering, and to recognize that their stories are not just ancient history, they are part of the ongoing struggle for equality and justice. As we journey further into the dark corners of medieval society, it's essential to pause and reflect on the sheer scale of the system that kept these women in bondage. The trade of human lives, particularly the trafficking of women, wasn't just an isolated occurrence, it was a deeply entrenched industry, with a far-reaching influence on the medieval economy. Slave markets existed not only in major urban centers but also in rural regions where people lived on the edges of survival. These markets were everywhere, and they were a key part of a system that relied on the exploitation of people, particularly women, for economic gain. One of the most unsettling aspects of this system was how normalized it became. It wasn't just the wealthy who bought and sold slaves, it was a practice that reached across different levels of society. The elite, of course, had the most power to control and profit from slavery, but even the lower classes participated in the system. Some of these women were bought to work in households, farms, or on large estates, while others were sent to the courts or brothels, where their worth was not only determined by labor but by their sexuality. It was a system that operated in nearly every facet of medieval life, from the smallest villages to the grandest courts, where women were bought and sold like property. When we think of medieval slavery, it's easy to picture it as something that happened far away, perhaps in distant empires or exotic lands. But the truth is that slavery was a reality right under the noses of many who lived through it. European nobles and merchants made enormous profits from slave trading, while everyday people might have witnessed the daily hustle and bustle of the market without ever questioning it. Women who were enslaved didn't always come from the poorest backgrounds. Some were captured in raids, others sold by desperate families, and still others born into the system. The entire structure was deeply embedded in medieval society, and it was so normalized that many never saw it as unjust. The entire economy, much like today, relied on exploitation, and those with power saw it as just a fact of life. In the medieval world, even the idea of freedom was largely restricted to men. The concept of a woman having her own life, free from the control of others, was practically unheard of. Women's identities were dictated by their relationship to men, whether fathers, husbands, or masters. This was true both for free women and those who were enslaved. A woman in medieval society didn't have the same freedoms as her male counterparts, and this inequality was built into every part of the system. For women who were enslaved, this lack of autonomy was even more severe. Their very existence was controlled by the whims of their owners. But we can't forget that, despite all the oppression, women in medieval slavery did not entirely lose their agency. While their lives were determined by their masters, there were moments, though rare, when they managed to assert their own power. Some women used their cunning to survive, manipulating situations to their advantage. Others used their connections or influence to gain small privileges. Still, these acts of resistance, though often subtle, were small victories in a world designed to strip them of every bit of power. It's these small acts of rebellion, sometimes forgotten by history, that helped them survive. Historians continue to debate how much agency enslaved women had in the medieval world. Some argue that there were more opportunities for resistance than we typically think, while others contend that the system was too powerful to allow for any meaningful change. It's difficult to know for sure, given how little documentation exists from the women themselves, but we do know that, despite the systemic barriers they faced, these women endured. They survived a world that denied them humanity, that reduced them to mere tools for the benefit of others. Their legacy is not one of absolute powerlessness, it's a legacy of survival and resilience, even in the most dire of circumstances. And let's not forget the psychological trauma that these women endured. Imagine being treated as less than human for your entire life. Imagine not knowing who you are because your identity is shaped entirely by your relationship to others. Enslaved women often lived their entire lives under the threat of abuse, violence, and exploitation. But perhaps the most brutal part of this reality was the way it affected them mentally. The constant dehumanization could strip a person of their self-worth, erasing any sense of identity or autonomy. The mental scars of such trauma would often last long after the physical chains were broken, passed down from one generation to the next. But there were also moments of defiance, however fleeting, that hinted at the power women still held over their own lives. When a slave woman managed to escape, even if for a short while. It was an act of profound resistance. It was a declaration that, despite the odds, she could control her fate. And for every woman who fought back, whether by running, by fighting, or by simply surviving, there were many more who suffered in silence, their voices lost to time. So, while we may never know the full extent of their suffering, we can be sure that the women of medieval slave markets were not just passive victims. They were survivors, fighters in their own way, and their legacy is one of quiet rebellion against a system that sought to control them. Their stories may have been erased, but their lives, their endurance, and their strength are far from forgotten. Now, as we delve even deeper into this historical quagmire, it's time to explore another aspect of medieval slavery: the tragic fate of children born to enslaved women. While the stories of these women have often been pushed to the margins of history, the impact of their suffering reverberated across generations, particularly through their children. A child born into slavery had no more hope of freedom than their mother. In fact, in many medieval societies, children born to enslaved women were considered slaves themselves, perpetuating the cycle of human trafficking for generations to come. Imagine being a child born into a world where your very identity is defined by your mother's position as property. From the moment you're born, you have no claim to your own future, your own autonomy. Your life is a commodity, traded and sold before you even have the ability to understand the world around you. The children of enslaved women were trapped in a system that saw them as little more than future laborers, future workers, future slaves. They had no inheritance, no freedom, no future beyond what was dictated by the whims of their masters. This perpetuation of slavery through birth made it even harder for women to escape the system. Even if a woman managed to escape her captors, her children would likely be forced to live the same fate she had suffered. If a woman were to escape, her heart would remain tied to the fate of her children, and this connection made true freedom virtually impossible. A mother's suffering was passed down to her children, and her despair was woven into their very lives. Some historians suggest that the system of inherited slavery was essential to the survival of slavery as an institution. Without the ability to pass down slavery from mother to child, the entire economic structure would have been under threat. Slavery wasn't just about taking individuals, it was about controlling families, lineages, and entire generations. The children of enslaved women were not just workers, they were the future of the system. This notion of perpetual servitude, where one generation's oppression would ensure the next's, was a powerful tool for keeping the status quo intact. For the enslaved women who gave birth to these children, the emotional weight was unbearable. These women lived with the knowledge that their children's futures were as bleak as their own, and that no matter how hard they worked, how many small acts of rebellion they committed, they couldn't save their children from the same fate. The emotional burden of knowing that your child was as much a prisoner as you were must have been one of the greatest agonies of all. And yet, these women fought through that pain every day, living with the hope, however faint, that there might be some way out, some way to change the future for the next generation. And yet, while this bleak cycle of inherited slavery persisted, there were small moments of resistance that, though often quiet and subtle, had a lasting impact. Women, despite being denied their agency, still found ways to maintain some semblance of dignity. They may have had no control over their position in the world, but they could control how they treated their children. Some women, through sheer force of will, instilled within their children a sense of hope, a belief that the system could be challenged. Others, through their small acts of defiance, passed on a legacy of resistance that, while not world-changing in their own time, would eventually contribute to the collapse of such systems. Some scholars argue that while these small acts of resistance may have been insignificant in the grand scheme of medieval society, they were not without value. The act of resisting the system, even in the smallest way, was a declaration that these women, despite everything, were still human. They were not mere tools or objects. They were people. The very fact that women continued to survive in such horrific circumstances, that they continued to defy the system by simply holding on to their sense of identity and dignity, is a testament to their strength. The notion that women, even in the direst of circumstances, continued to fight for their children and for their own survival is one of the most powerful aspects of this history. These women were not just victims of a brutal system, they were survivors. Their resistance was not just an act of rebellion against their masters, but a declaration of their humanity. And while the system sought to erase them, to turn them into property and labor, their ability to hold on to their identity, their strength, and their dignity is what makes their legacy endure. It's also essential to recognize the broader implications of this inherited system of slavery. The economic and social structures that relied on enslaved women were not just local, they were global in scope. The trade of enslaved people spanned continents, with markets in Europe, Africa, and the Middle East all connected by the same brutal system. This international web of human trafficking helped to fuel economies, maintain social hierarchies, and ensure that the oppression of women and children continued for centuries. Historians still argue over the role of these global networks in shaping medieval slavery. Some believe that the international trade of slaves helped to reinforce the practice, making it an integral part of the medieval economic system. Others suggest that the practice was more localized, with regional variations in the way women and children were exploited. Either way, the consequences of this system were devastating. Women were sold across borders, transported to foreign lands, and forced to serve in conditions that stripped them of every ounce of humanity. Their children, born into this system, were doomed to continue the cycle of exploitation. As we dig deeper into the lives of these enslaved women, it's important to examine not just their suffering, but their potential for transformation. While the medieval system of slavery sought to strip them of every shred of autonomy and humanity, there were moments, however rare, when enslaved women managed to rewrite their stories. Despite being surrounded by a world that saw them as property, some women found ways to assert their agency, even within the confines of their grim circumstances. The idea of agency might seem almost impossible for someone who was viewed as nothing more than a tool or a piece of property. After all, what power could a woman have when her body was sold, her future determined by someone else? But history has a funny way of highlighting the ways in which people, especially women, find ways to resist, even in the smallest of actions. These acts of resistance were often quiet, subtle, and mostly invisible, but they represented a flicker of defiance in a world designed to suppress it. Take, for example, the women who, despite being sold into forced labor, found small ways to gain a measure of control over their circumstances. Some used their intelligence and charm to influence their masters. A slave might manipulate her position to secure better living conditions or gain a bit more autonomy in her daily life. Others found ways to connect with fellow slaves, forming bonds of solidarity that allowed them to resist in subtle ways, sabotaging work, delaying tasks, or simply offering one another emotional support. These small acts, though largely overlooked by history, were incredibly powerful in a system that depended on total control. In some cases, women could resist more openly. The rare instances of runaway slaves offer us a glimpse of a form of resistance that was far more overt. While escaping wasn't always possible due to the constant surveillance and severe punishments, some women managed to slip away, seeking refuge in towns, forests, or hidden away in the cities. This form of resistance was dangerous, often resulting in brutal retaliation if the woman was caught. But the mere fact that it happened is telling. It's proof that even in the most hopeless situations, enslaved women sought to reclaim their freedom, even if it was fleeting. Historians have long debated how effective these acts of resistance were, or whether they had any lasting impact on the system of slavery. Some believe that the resistance of enslaved women was largely symbolic, offering little more than a brief moment of escape before they were recaptured. Others suggest that these small acts, taken together, helped to slowly erode the foundation of the slave system. While these acts of defiance didn't immediately lead to large-scale uprisings, they were still a form of rebellion against a system that tried to rob them of their humanity. But perhaps the most significant form of resistance was the simple act of survival. By enduring the brutality of the system, These women demonstrated a kind of quiet strength. They survived, day by day, in a world that offered them no hope, no freedom, and no future. And in doing so, they left a legacy of resilience that continues to shape how we understand the struggle for freedom today. These women didn't just survive slavery, they endured it with a strength that many of us can't fully comprehend. They maintained their sense of self, even when society, law, and religion told them they were nothing. They were mothers, daughters, and sisters who fought for each other, who found ways to support each other, and who found moments of joy in an otherwise grim existence. Their resistance wasn't always loud or visible, but it was no less significant than the large-scale revolts we might associate with slave uprisings. As we look back on their stories, we can see that the fight for freedom isn't always about grand gestures or massive revolutions. Sometimes, it's about the small acts of defiance that occur when no one is watching. It's about the quiet rebellion of a woman who finds a way to care for her child despite the harshest conditions. It's about the strength to resist, even when it seems like there is no hope left. Yet, despite the many acts of resistance, the system of medieval slavery endured for centuries. It was a system that, at its core, was built on the dehumanization of people, especially women. And while these small rebellions were important, they were not enough to overturn the system entirely. The real battle against slavery would not come until later, when larger social, political, and economic forces began to shift. Historians continue to grapple with why slavery endured for so long in medieval society. Some believe it was the economic value that slavery brought to the feudal system. Slaves provided cheap labor for the rich, which allowed for the accumulation of wealth. Others argue that it was the deeply ingrained cultural and religious views about women and their role in society that perpetuated the system. Regardless of the reasons, it's clear that the oppression of women in these markets was not just a temporary or isolated phenomenon. It was a deeply entrenched system that affected every facet of medieval life. Today, we recognize that the fight for freedom, for equality, is ongoing. While slavery may have been abolished in most parts of the world, the commodification of women continues in various forms, particularly in the modern-day sex trade and human trafficking. The exploitation of women's bodies is still a global issue, and the legacy of medieval slavery still lingers in the way we think about and treat women in many societies. As we reflect on the lives of these enslaved women, we honor their strength, their resilience, and their quiet acts of defiance. Their stories may have been forgotten by history, but their legacy lives on in the struggles we face today. The fight for freedom, for dignity, and for equality continues. And as long as we remember their stories, we keep that fight alive. By now, the stark realities of medieval slavery have unfolded before us, and we've witnessed how deeply entrenched and brutal the system was for enslaved women. Yet, even in the darkest corners of history, there is light. The sheer survival of these women, enduring a system that stripped them of everything identity, autonomy, and dignity, becomes a powerful symbol of resistance. But it's not just their survival that speaks volumes. It's the fact that in a world built on their subjugation, women still found moments of strength, and sometimes even power, despite the odds stacked against them. But let's take a step back and look at something that might seem peripheral at first: the legacy of medieval slavery and how it still reverberates today. The medieval slave markets didn't just end with the fall of feudalism or the shift in power structures, they left an indelible mark on society. While the system of medieval slavery eventually gave way to different forms of oppression, the ways in which women were commodified, dehumanized, and controlled continue to shape the experiences of women in the modern world. The truth is, the echoes of medieval slavery can still be seen in the global issue of human trafficking. Women, just like those sold in the medieval markets, are still bought and sold today. Modern slavery doesn't look exactly the same as it did in medieval times, but the commodification of women's bodies and the control over their lives is eerily similar. Whether it's sex trafficking, forced labor, or domestic servitude, women continue to be treated as commodities, their worth tied to what they can provide for others, whether that's physical labor, sexual service, or children. In some ways, it feels as though we are trapped in a cycle where the struggles of women in the past are mirrored in the struggles of women today. The systems of oppression that kept women in bondage for centuries have evolved, but they have not disappeared. The slavery of medieval markets has transformed into new forms of exploitation that are often hidden from public view. But the heart of the issue remains the same. Women are still being controlled, manipulated, and dehumanized. Historians still debate whether medieval slavery laid the groundwork for modern forms of human trafficking. Some suggest that the global networks of trade, which connected slave markets in Europe, Africa, and the Middle East, helped to create a foundation for the commodification of human beings. Others believe that these medieval practices were an anomaly, and that modern slavery evolved independently. But no matter where you stand in this debate, one thing is clear. The legacy of medieval slavery is alive and well in the exploitation of women today. As we examine this legacy, we also need to think about the ways in which modern society perpetuates the objectification of women. From advertising that sells beauty and sex, to the constant portrayal of women as mere objects in popular media, the dehumanization that began in the medieval slave markets still shapes how we view women today. Women's bodies are commodified in ways that reflect the same attitudes held by medieval slave owners' values, rooted in the belief that women exist to serve and to satisfy the desires of others. These values are often subtle, woven into the fabric of everyday life, but their impact is no less harmful. The fight against this objectification and exploitation continues, with movements like Me Too and others working to challenge the way women are portrayed, treated, and viewed. But despite these efforts, the reality is that the cycle of dehumanization continues. Women, like the ones sold in medieval markets, are still fighting for control over their bodies, their futures, and their rights. The fight for equality is far from over, and as long as there are systems in place that profit from the suffering of women, that fight will continue. But in acknowledging this ongoing struggle, it's also important to honor the women who came before us. Their stories, though largely forgotten, are vital to understanding the depths of human resilience. The women of the medieval slave markets may not have had a voice, but their strength, their suffering, and their endurance have been passed down through generations. They remind us that even in the most brutal of systems, there is always room for survival, for small acts of rebellion, and for hope. The question we must ask ourselves today is, how do we break the cycle? How do we ensure that the suffering of these women doesn't continue into the future? The answer lies in recognizing the legacy of their oppression and understanding how it continues to manifest in modern society. We must strive to dismantle the systems that commodify women, and we must fight to ensure that no woman ever has to endure the same fate as those sold in the medieval markets. As we close this chapter of history, it's important to remember that the story of medieval slavery is not just a tale of the past, it's a reminder of the work still left to do. The fight for equality, for freedom, and for the dignity of all women is ongoing. By acknowledging the past, we gain the strength to fight for a better future. As we continue to explore the tangled web of medieval slavery, let's take a moment to reflect on something that's often overlooked: the incredible psychological toll that living as an enslaved woman would have exacted. It's one thing to endure physical suffering, but to live every day with the knowledge that your very existence is dictated by another person's whims, that's a kind of mental and emotional anguish that's hard to fully comprehend. The trauma these women faced didn't just end when they were bought and sold in the markets. It was woven into every moment of their lives. A woman enslaved in medieval society had no sense of control over her future, no hope of shaping her own destiny. Her value was determined by how useful she could be to her master, how many children she could bear, how hard she could work, how sexually appealing she was. The stripping away of autonomy, of identity, was so complete that it wasn't just a matter of losing a job or a home, it was the loss of everything that made her human. Psychologists today would call this the breakdown of self-identity. When your entire existence is defined by what you can provide for someone else, when your mind, your body, and your future are all owned by another person, you lose any sense of agency. You stop seeing yourself as a person and begin to view yourself as an object. This psychological damage was one of the most insidious aspects of slavery in medieval markets. While the physical hardships were harrowing enough, it was the emotional and mental toll that truly took away these women's humanity. Imagine the mental strain of waking up every day, knowing that you are not in control of your body, your movements, or your relationships. For many of these women, there was no hope of ever escaping this life. The constant fear of being sold, of being separated from your children, of being punished for any form of disobedience, this constant state of anxiety took a tremendous psychological toll. The idea of home became meaningless. What did a home mean when it wasn't yours, when it was just another place where you were owned, another place where your fate was determined by someone else? And then there was the trauma of witnessing the same fate befall your children. When a child was born into slavery, they too became property. No future, no freedom, no choice. The psychological agony of knowing that your children would suffer the same fate you did, that they would never be free, must have been unbearable. As a mother, this was perhaps the greatest tragedy. The complete inability to protect your own children from the horrors you experienced. Historians still wrestle with the concept of slave psychology. How did enslaved women cope mentally with their lives? Were there ways in which they resisted the mental degradation of their condition? Some scholars suggest that women found small ways to maintain their dignity, even if it was only in their minds. They found solace in small moments of rebellion, whether it was in the way they cared for their children, or in the brief connections they forged with other enslaved individuals. These acts, though small, were essential to their survival. While it's easy to focus on the more visible aspects of slavery, the chains, the whips, the physical labor, it's crucial to recognize the mental toll this system took on women. In fact, the emotional and psychological damage may have been the most lasting part of their suffering. Even if a woman escaped slavery physically, the psychological scars often lingered far longer. The trauma of being treated as an object, of being denied any autonomy, left deep scars that shaped not just the individual, but entire generations of people born into the same system. The ripple effects of this trauma didn't just disappear with the end of slavery. The psychological damage caused by centuries of systemic oppression was passed down through generations, affecting families and communities in ways that were often invisible to those outside of the system. Even when slavery was abolished, the mental and emotional scars remained, influencing how women were viewed and treated in the centuries that followed. The echoes of medieval slavery can still be heard in the struggles of women today, who continue to fight for equality, dignity, and respect. One of the most striking things about the psychology of slavery is the way in which the human spirit can endure, even in the most dehumanizing conditions. Despite everything, despite the physical violence, the constant fear, and the psychological torment, these women survived. They may have lost much of their sense of self, but they did not lose their will to live. In the face of almost unimaginable oppression, many still found ways to fight, to resist, to survive. Historians still debate how much mental resilience these women could have had in such dire circumstances. Some argue that the psychological damage was too great for any form of resistance to have taken root, while others suggest that the very fact of survival is an act of rebellion in itself. The truth is likely somewhere in between. These women were not immune to the psychological horrors of slavery, but they found ways to keep going, to push through the mental anguish, to survive one day at a time. Their survival, their endurance, is a testament to the strength of the human spirit. It is a reminder that even when everything is taken away, when your body is enslaved, your future denied, your identity erased, you can still survive. And in that survival, you send a message to the world that even the most oppressive systems can't completely destroy a person's soul. As we continue to reflect on the lives of enslaved women, we shift our focus to a broader and more uncomfortable reality. How medieval slavery, particularly the commodification of women, was deeply intertwined with the very fabric of power, politics, and economics. The way women were treated, bought, and sold wasn't just an isolated phenomenon. It was a reflection of a larger societal system designed to perpetuate inequality and control. The medieval markets, though long gone, laid the groundwork for social structures that would continue to dehumanize women for centuries. Let's step back for a moment and think about how much the lives of enslaved women were tied to the political ambitions of the powerful. In medieval times, the ruling elite didn't just control land or wealth, they controlled people, particularly the women who were used to maintain and increase their power. The political system of feudalism, for example, was built on the foundation of control and exploitation, and women were often seen as part of this equation. They were used as political tools, traded in exchange for land, alliances, or social capital. In many cases, women were married off or sold to strengthen alliances between powerful families or kingdoms. This is where the exploitation of women goes beyond physical labor and reproduction. The very idea of a woman's value being based on what she could offer in terms of alliances or political gain was a common practice among the elite. In fact, many noble families would sell or exchange their daughters to form alliances with other wealthy families or to gain favor with the ruling class. Women, in this context, weren't just workers or mothers, they were instruments of power. They were pieces on a political chessboard, traded to secure land, wealth, or influence. Think about how this system shaped women's lives in medieval society. If a woman was born into a noble family, her worth wasn't determined by her abilities or personality, it was determined by her marriage ability. She was often married off at a young age, not for love, but for political gain. The idea that women's worth was tied to their ability to form strategic alliances reinforced the notion that they were little more than property. Even women who were not enslaved were subject to this societal expectation, their lives shaped by the decisions of the men around them. It's no wonder, then, that women in the slave markets were seen as even more expendable. In many ways, the treatment of enslaved women mirrored the way women in the upper classes were treated. Both were objects to be controlled and used to advance the interests of men. The idea that a woman's value was tied to her utility, whether it was in producing labor, children, or political alliances, was a common theme throughout medieval society. This view was reinforced by religious doctrines, social norms, and legal systems, all of which worked together to ensure that women remained in a subservient role. But this system of control wasn't just limited to the elite. Even in the lower classes, women had little say in their fate. Enslaved women in the markets were bought and sold based on their perceived worth, how useful they could be, how attractive they were, how many children they could bear. The control over women's bodies extended beyond the physical realm and into the psychological and emotional spheres as well. Enslaved women were constantly reminded that their worth was determined by what they could offer to others, whether it was work, reproduction, or sexual pleasure. In this sense, their lives were not their own, they were defined entirely by the desires and demands of others. Historians still debate whether the treatment of women in medieval society was more about maintaining power or whether it was simply a product of cultural norms. Some argue that the system of slavery was a natural extension of the feudal system, which was based on the idea of ownership and control. Others suggest that it was the societal structure itself built on male dominance and patriarchal values that led to the commodification of women. Either way, the fact remains that women were seen as tools to be used, their value measured by their ability to serve the needs of the powerful. But let's not fall into the trap of thinking that this was all inevitable, or that women had no means of resistance. While the system was deeply entrenched, it wasn't without its cracks. Even in the face of this overwhelming control, there were moments of resistance, moments when women fought back, however subtly, against the forces that sought to dominate them. Whether it was through small acts of defiance, the manipulation of their circumstances, or the small moments of rebellion that marked their lives, enslaved women found ways to assert their humanity in a world that tried to strip it away. Historians argue over whether these acts of resistance were enough to change the course of history. Some believe that the individual acts of rebellion, though seemingly insignificant, helped to shift the balance of power while others suggest that these acts were simply fleeting moments in a much larger system that was nearly impossible to dismantle. But one thing is certain: these moments of resistance, however small, were proof that these women were not mere objects. They were people. And in that small act of defiance, they demonstrated that even in the most oppressive systems, the human spirit can find a way to fight back. In many ways, the story of medieval slavery is not just the story of the women who were sold in markets. It's the story of how power, politics, and economics are intertwined with the dehumanization of the vulnerable. The lessons we can learn from these women, their strength, their resilience, their subtle acts of resistance, are not just historical lessons. They are lessons that continue to resonate in our fight for equality and justice today. The system of control that women faced in the medieval markets may have ended, but the struggle for autonomy, for control over one's body, and for equality continues in the modern world. As we step further into the realities of medieval slavery, it's important to consider the broader implications of how these women were seen in their societies. The treatment of enslaved women wasn't just about individual acts of cruelty or exploitation. It was a reflection of societal attitudes toward women in general. In medieval times, women's worth was tied to their relationships with men, whether that meant being a daughter, a wife, or tragically, a slave. The patriarchal structures that governed medieval society viewed women as secondary to men, reinforcing the idea that their lives were to be controlled and directed by others. In the feudal system, women were often defined by the roles they played within the household or in the production of labor. But for enslaved women, their value extended beyond these traditional roles. They were viewed as objects to be used for reproduction and labor, with little regard for their personal agency or desires. This idea was not confined to the upper echelons of society but pervaded every level. In the slave markets, women's bodies were treated as commodities, their worth determined by their physical capabilities and reproductive potential, not by who they were as individuals. This notion of ownership over women's bodies was deeply ingrained in medieval society. From noble households to the common folk, the idea that women could be bought and sold, used for the benefit of men, was accepted as a fact of life. Even the Church, despite its teachings on compassion and the sanctity of life, often turned a blind eye to the exploitation of women. The women in the slave markets were seen not as people but as tools to be worked, bred, and discarded as needed. They had little say in their futures, and their very identities were shaped by the desires of others. But the system of control wasn't just about economics or power, it was about gender. The structure of medieval society, built on male dominance, allowed for the commodification of women to persist for centuries. Whether it was in the form of slavery, forced marriage, or simple societal expectations, women were expected to serve the needs of men. And for those who found themselves in the brutal system of the slave markets, this subjugation was taken to its extreme. Despite the crushing nature of their circumstances, enslaved women displayed resilience. Even in a system designed to strip them of their autonomy, they managed to carve out moments of agency. Some resisted through small acts of defiance, whether by slowing down their work or finding ways to protect their children. Others used their positions to manipulate the system to their advantage, gaining small privileges in exchange for compliance. These acts, though often unnoticed or dismissed, were crucial in maintaining their sense of self in a world that wanted to erase their humanity. There were also rare cases where women managed to escape. Though it was nearly impossible for many, there were instances where enslaved women ran away, seeking freedom or refuge in cities, forests, or among sympathetic communities. These escapes were not always successful, but they represented a form of rebellion that showed the strength and determination of these women. Even when the risk of punishment was high, the desire for freedom, the basic human need to control one's own life, was so strong that it drove some to take the chance. This desire for autonomy, for freedom from the system that controlled their every move, was the heart of the resistance. It wasn't always about grand uprisings or revolutionary acts. Sometimes it was simply the act of surviving, of pushing back against the forces that sought to dominate. The subtle forms of resistance may not have brought about immediate change, but they kept alive the spirit of rebellion, and in doing so, they made it clear that these women were not simply property, they were people, with their own wills, desires, and right to freedom. In the grand scheme of history, it's easy to overlook the small acts of rebellion that happen in the shadows. But these acts, though they may have seemed insignificant at the time, contributed to the larger movement against slavery and the oppression of women. The stories of these women, though largely erased from history, are not ones of total defeat. They are stories of endurance, of quiet resistance, and of the unbreakable strength of the human spirit. While the system of slavery eventually gave way to new forms of oppression, the legacy of these women is still with us. The struggles they faced, the systems they fought against, are echoed in the fight for equality today. The control of women's bodies, their subjugation to the desires of others, continues in various forms across the world. The fight for autonomy, dignity, and equality is ongoing. And as we remember the stories of those who came before us, we are reminded of the importance of continuing this fight, of ensuring that no woman is ever again reduced to mere property. As we delve deeper into the life and struggles of enslaved women in medieval markets, we can't ignore how this system of oppression profoundly shaped the world beyond the market stalls. The trade in women didn't just impact the immediate victims, it rippled through entire societies, creating a complex web of power, control, and exploitation that reached far beyond the realm of slavery itself. The legacy of medieval slavery can still be felt today, not only in the direct continuation of human trafficking, but also in the ways that women's roles have historically been confined, limited, and controlled by patriarchal systems. It's vital to recognize that while medieval slavery was undoubtedly horrific, it was not an isolated phenomenon. The way women were treated in the slave markets was part of a much larger pattern of systemic subjugation that spanned centuries. Women's lives, their rights, and their identities were molded by a culture that sought to reduce them to objects for men's use, whether for reproduction, labor, or sexual purposes. This treatment of women didn't just exist in the margins of society, it was integrated into the core structures of medieval life, from the way wealth and power were maintained to the very way families and communities operated. Take, for example, the economic role that enslaved women played. While men controlled the political and military power of the medieval world, women were often relegated to the role of laborers, caregivers, and childbearers. But for enslaved women, this role was even more oppressive. Their labor wasn't just demanded for domestic purposes, it was used as a way to fuel the feudal economy. They were forced into agricultural labor, domestic service, and, in many cases, sexual exploitation. And yet, these women were never seen as equals in their own right. They were constantly defined by what they could do for others, never allowed to exist as independent beings with hopes, dreams, or desires. The widespread use of women as laborers and childbearers served to reinforce the larger power structures of medieval society. The wealthy landowners, nobles, and rulers needed workers to maintain their estates, farms, and households, and enslaved women were the most vulnerable to exploitation. Their worth was based solely on their ability to serve these needs. The cycle of slavery, then, wasn't just about the immediate owners, it was about maintaining a social structure that relied on the perpetual subjugation of those without power. Enslaved women were the backbone of this system, quietly supporting the wealth and power of the ruling elite. But it wasn't just economic control that kept these women trapped in their circumstances. It was also social and religious control. The medieval church, despite its claims of compassion and moral teachings, often turned a blind eye to the plight of enslaved women. While the church preached about love, charity, and the dignity of human life, it also participated in, and at times, endorsed systems that kept women in servitude. The church's teachings about women's place in society were rooted in a patriarchal view that saw women as subordinate to men. This view was reinforced through religious doctrine, legal systems, and cultural norms, which all worked together to keep women in positions of subjugation. It's worth considering the role that religion played in perpetuating these systems of control. On the one hand, religious leaders may have been the architects of some of the laws that governed women's lives, creating frameworks that sanctioned their exploitation. On the other hand, the teachings of the Church also provided moral justification for enslaving women, and by extension, the commodification of their bodies. This made it easier for the elites to view women not as people with rights, but as property, just like land or livestock. And in a society that viewed women this way, the idea of slavery was not just accepted, it was normalized. This normalization of slavery in medieval society is something we must confront today. The treatment of women in the past may seem like a distant historical reality, but the echoes of this past can still be heard in modern-day issues like human trafficking, gender inequality, and the persistent objectification of women's bodies. The control over women's bodies, both physically and psychologically, is something that continues to affect women across the globe, whether it's through the sex trade, forced labor, or the denial of reproductive rights. The commodification of women remains a powerful tool of control. Yet, despite all of this, the stories of resistance from enslaved women stand as testaments to their strength, resilience, and dignity. These women, despite being stripped of their rights, their identity, and often their very humanity, managed to survive and sometimes even fight back, whether through small acts of defiance, manipulation of their masters, or, in rare cases, outright escape. Enslaved women found ways to reclaim some measure of control. Even in the face of overwhelming odds, they held on to their humanity and their will to live. The small rebellions of enslaved women, while they may not have brought down the system of slavery in one swift blow, were crucial in keeping hope alive. These women, in their quiet acts of resistance, demonstrated that no system, no matter how entrenched, could completely break the human spirit. Their survival became a form of rebellion in itself. And while we may never know the full extent of their actions, we do know that they fought, in whatever ways they could, to maintain their dignity. In considering the legacy of medieval slavery, it's clear that the struggles of these women are not just historical curiosities, they are reminders of the ongoing fight for gender equality and human rights. The lessons we can learn from the women in these markets are still relevant today. As long as women are still objectified, trafficked, and oppressed, the fight for their autonomy continues. The stories of these women, though buried by history, can still inspire us in our efforts to create a world where women's worth is not defined by others, but by their own power and agency. As we reflect on the persistent injustices faced by medieval enslaved women, it's essential to acknowledge the human capacity for endurance and resilience in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. The oppression these women experienced was not only physical but psychological, emotional, and social. While the narratives of their lives were often lost to history, their strength is undeniable. These women were not passive victims, they were fighters in a system that sought to strip away every aspect of their humanity. Even within the crushing constraints of medieval slavery, they found ways to resist, survive, and maintain some sense of self. It's crucial to understand that resistance in these contexts didn't always look like what we might expect. There were no large-scale revolts, no sweeping movements to abolish the system, at least not immediately. Instead, resistance was often quiet, small, and subtle. Many women's acts of defiance were invisible, perhaps not even recognized as resistance by those around them. Yet, they were acts of survival. Whether it was a slave woman slowing down her work, refusing to perform certain tasks, or even using her wit to manipulate her situation, these small acts of rebellion were vital in maintaining some sense of agency. Even in situations where women were forced into the most horrific of circumstances, working in brothels, being forced to bear children, and serving as tools for political or economic gain, they resisted. Some resisted by finding moments of solace, by forming emotional bonds with other enslaved individuals, and by passing down the knowledge and hope of a different life. While they were robbed of many rights, one thing that could not be taken from them was their ability to hold on to their inner strength, their sense of self, and the bonds they formed with others. One thing we often overlook is the fact that even the act of survival was, in itself, an act of resistance. These women lived lives full of violence, fear, and hopelessness. They were systematically stripped of their identity and autonomy, yet they survived. Their ability to maintain any shred of hope, to continue on in a world designed to erase their humanity, is a testament to the strength of the human spirit. These women were not defeated by the system, they endured it, and in doing so, they resisted the forces that sought to break them. It's important to recognize that, despite the immense challenges they faced, these women were not completely powerless. They lived in a world that sought to erase them, to strip them of everything that made them human. But even within this system, they found ways to assert themselves. These women may have been sold as property, but they were more than that. They were mothers, sisters, daughters, and individuals with desires, hopes, and fears. They were not defined solely by their suffering, they were whole people, shaped by their experiences, yes, but still deeply human. As we reflect on the legacy of these women, we must also think about the broader social and cultural forces that perpetuated this system. The medieval slave market wasn't just a product of individual cruelty, it was part of a much larger system of patriarchy and exploitation. The way society viewed women, particularly enslaved women, was rooted in the idea that women existed to serve the needs of men. This was reinforced by religious doctrines, legal systems, and cultural norms. The idea that women were subservient, that their bodies were not their own, was ingrained in every part of medieval society. Even as the medieval world eventually evolved and slavery began to wane, the underlying beliefs that led to the commodification of women didn't vanish overnight. These beliefs persisted, shaping future generations and continuing to influence the way women were treated in later centuries. The fight for women's rights, for autonomy, and for equality didn't end with the medieval period, it continued into the modern era and remains an ongoing struggle today. The legacies of medieval slavery are still felt in modern systems of oppression. While the practice of buying and selling women may have ended, the exploitation and objectification of women continues in various forms. Human trafficking, forced labor, and sexual exploitation all serve as grim reminders that the commodification of women's bodies is not a thing of the past. These modern-day systems of control are directly tied to the same power structures that existed centuries ago, structures that sought to strip women of their humanity, autonomy, and dignity. As we confront these issues today, it's important to remember the women who lived through these brutal systems and to honor their stories. The pain and suffering they endured must never be forgotten, but their strength and resilience should be celebrated. Their lives were not defined solely by the cruelty they experienced. They were also defined by their ability to survive, resist, and hold on to their humanity in the face of overwhelming odds. The history of enslaved women in medieval markets is not just a story of oppression, it's a story of resistance, survival, and the enduring power of the human spirit. As we reflect on their lives, we must also think about the future. The fight for gender equality, for freedom, and for the autonomy of women continues. The struggles faced by women centuries ago are echoed in the struggles faced by women today. And as long as the systems of exploitation and oppression continue, we must honor the legacy of these women by continuing the fight for justice, equality, and freedom for all. As we continue to reflect on the legacy of medieval slavery and the incredible resilience of the women caught within its system, it becomes increasingly clear that their stories are not just pieces of history, they are an essential part of understanding the present. The suffering, endurance, and small victories of these enslaved women continue to shape how we view power, inequality, and gender relations today. In fact, the echoes of their experiences can be seen in the ongoing struggles for women's rights, both globally and in our own communities. While the medieval system of slavery may have been formally dismantled, the structures of control, exploitation, and objectification that shaped those markets are still alive in various forms. These women were treated as less than human commodities to be bought, sold, and exploited for their labor, reproductive abilities, and sexuality. This view, rooted in centuries of patriarchal beliefs, didn't simply vanish with the end of slavery. Instead, it evolved into modern systems of human trafficking, forced labor, and gender-based violence. These forms of exploitation may not look exactly like the medieval slave markets, but they are built on the same foundational ideas, that women's bodies are objects to be used and controlled by others. In the present day, we still see women being commodified, whether through the sex trade, domestic labor, or in various forms of modern slavery. Women continue to be objectified and exploited for their labor and their bodies. The global sex trafficking industry, for example, operates on many of the same principles that governed the medieval slave markets. Women are kidnapped, coerced, or sold into sexual servitude, their humanity stripped away in the same way it was for those in the markets centuries ago. Though modern laws and social movements have made strides toward protecting women's rights, the underlying cultural views about women's roles in society have not disappeared. It's important to understand that these systems of exploitation are not just personal failings or isolated incidents, they are symptoms of deeper societal structures that continue to exist. The roots of these problems can be traced back to the medieval era, when women were defined by their utility to others, particularly to men. Whether in the form of domestic servitude, sexual exploitation, or forced labor, women were seen as commodities, and this perception still influences how they are treated in many parts of the world today. For example, think about the ways in which women's worth is often still tied to their appearance, reproductive ability, or their capacity to serve others. These ideas have been perpetuated by centuries of social conditioning, religious doctrines, and cultural practices that sought to restrict women's autonomy and limit their roles to those defined by men. Even in the modern era, women are still often valued for what they can provide, whether in terms of domestic labor, sex, or even just their appearance. In advertising, the media, and even the workplace, the commodification of women continues, and the messages of objectification and subordination remain loud and clear. However, while it may feel like this cycle of exploitation will never end, the legacy of resistance left behind by enslaved women in medieval markets offers hope. The small, quiet acts of defiance that these women practiced in the face of immense oppression laid the groundwork for the resistance movements we see today. Their survival, their resilience, and their ability to fight back, even in the smallest ways, have inspired generations of women to continue pushing for change. Women who were sold into slavery in medieval markets may have had their voices silenced, but their legacy lives on in the activism, the struggles, and the resilience of women fighting for equality today. The fight for gender equality, for the abolition of modern-day slavery, and for the protection of women's rights is far from over. But by remembering the women of medieval slave markets and honoring their strength, we can draw inspiration to continue pushing for change. We are reminded that even in the most oppressive systems, the human spirit has the power to resist, survive, and ultimately transform the world. The stories of the enslaved women in the medieval markets are not just stories of pain, they are stories of hope, endurance, and survival. They teach us that even when systems seem insurmountable, resistance is possible. Every act of defiance, no matter how small, is a victory. Every woman who fought back, who survived, and who held on to her humanity in the face of unimaginable hardship is a testament to the strength of the human spirit. As we move forward in our own time, let us honor the memory of these women by continuing the fight for justice and equality. Their stories should not be forgotten, but celebrated as a reminder of how far we've come and how much further we still have to go. The fight for freedom, dignity, and respect for all women is ongoing, and it is our responsibility to carry their legacy forward, ensuring that no woman is ever reduced to property again. As we near the end of our exploration into the lives of medieval enslaved women, it's important to reflect on the lasting impact of their experiences, not only on the historical trajectory of slavery, but on the broader fight for human rights and gender equality. The brutality of the medieval slave markets is not something confined to the distant past. The stories of these women serve as a lens through which we can examine the way society continues to treat women today. Understanding the deep roots of exploitation and resistance provides us with the necessary context to continue fighting for justice and equality in our world. The women who were sold in these markets may have been invisible in their time, their voices largely erased from history, but their legacy is powerful. Their strength, their resilience, and their small acts of resistance continue to inspire modern-day movements for women's rights. The fight against human trafficking, sexual exploitation, and gender-based violence is, in many ways, an extension of the struggles these medieval women endured. While the structures of medieval slavery may have evolved over time, the patterns of oppression and control over women's bodies are still tragically relevant. In modern society, women's bodies continue to be commodified, whether through the sex trade, in advertising, or in the expectations placed upon them in the workplace and in relationships. The notion that women are valuable only insofar as they serve others, whether through reproductive labor or sexual service, is deeply ingrained in the social fabric. But just as those medieval women found ways to resist, so too can we continue to challenge these harmful narratives. It's not enough to simply acknowledge the history of women's oppression. We must actively work to dismantle the systems that perpetuate these inequalities. The struggle for gender equality today is inseparable from the history of women like those who were sold in medieval markets. We must recognize that the fight for women's rights, freedom, and dignity has always been ongoing. Every generation builds upon the last, learning from the past and pushing forward to create a more just world. By remembering the lives of these women, we not only honor their suffering but also draw strength from their courage and resilience. It is also essential to recognize that the abolition of slavery, though a monumental victory, did not erase the systems of oppression that women faced. Modern-day slavery may look different from the medieval markets, but the exploitation of women, the control of their bodies, and the devaluation of their lives persists. The cycle of commodification continues, and as long as women are objectified, trafficked, and treated as less than human, the fight for equality remains just as urgent today as it was in the past. There is no easy answer to how we break this cycle of exploitation. The structures that uphold gender inequality are complex, and they are deeply rooted in centuries of cultural, social, and economic practices. But one thing is certain: by continuing to remember the stories of enslaved women, by learning from the history of their resistance, we can take powerful steps toward creating a world where no woman is ever again reduced to property. Their strength, their survival, and their quiet acts of rebellion provide a roadmap for our own struggle for justice. In the end, the legacy of these women is not one of absolute defeat, but of survival, resistance, and the unbreakable will to hold on to their humanity, even in the face of unimaginable hardship. Their stories may have been hidden by history, but they are far from forgotten. Today, we continue their fight, building on their resilience and continuing the work they began. Their fight is our fight, a fight for the freedom, dignity, and equality of all women in every corner of the world. As we move forward, let us remember that while the systems of oppression that enslaved women in medieval markets may have shifted, they have not disappeared. The work is not over, and it is our responsibility to ensure that we honor the past by working toward a future where every woman is free to define her own life, where her body is her own, and where her worth is recognized as intrinsic to her humanity. The legacy of these women, and the lessons they teach us, must continue to inspire us to take action to fight for the world they were denied, and to ensure that no woman is ever again sold, commodified, or exploited. As we move deeper into understanding the long-lasting impact of medieval slavery, it's essential to look at the broader societal forces that made such a system possible. These systems were not merely the work of individual slavers or traders, they were the result of ingrained cultural norms, laws, and institutions that sustained the oppression of enslaved women for generations. Slavery, particularly the enslavement of women, was an integral part of the medieval economy, but it was also tightly bound to the power dynamics that governed society as a whole. One of the most disturbing aspects of medieval slavery was the way in which women's bodies were used as tools of both labor and reproduction. For enslaved women, their value was not just about the work they could do, it was about their ability to produce children, especially male heirs. A woman's ability to bear children was viewed as one of her most valuable attributes, and this was reflected in the way she was treated within the system. This view of women as breeding vessels, valued only for their reproductive potential, has echoes in the modern world, where women's bodies are still often seen as commodities in certain industries, particularly in the realms of reproductive technology and the sex trade. But the impact of this commodification goes beyond the physical exploitation of women. It also shaped the very way society viewed women's roles and worth. In medieval times, women were often seen as subordinate to men, and their worth was tied to their ability to serve male needs, whether through labor, marriage, or reproduction. This ideology permeated not only the slave markets but also the broader social and cultural attitudes of the time. Women were taught to accept their place in society as second-class citizens, valued not for who they were, but for what they could give to others. In this context, the survival of enslaved women becomes even more remarkable. They were born into systems that dehumanized them, systems that valued them only for their labor and their reproductive potential. Yet, despite the overwhelming odds stacked against them, many of these women resisted, fought for their survival, and found ways to hold on to their dignity. Even in a world that told them they were nothing more than property, these women found ways to assert their humanity. While we focus on the historical realities of medieval slavery, it's important to understand that the underlying cultural, economic, and social forces that allowed such systems to thrive are still with us today. Modern-day slavery, human trafficking, and the exploitation of women's bodies continue to be pervasive problems, rooted in many of the same patriarchal and capitalist ideologies that dominated medieval society. The fight for women's rights, for the abolition of modern slavery, and for the equality of all people is ongoing, and the lessons we can learn from the stories of enslaved women in medieval markets are still highly relevant. As we examine the enduring legacy of medieval slavery, it's crucial to look at the systems of power that upheld it, and how those systems continue to echo in modern societies. The medieval world was structured around control and exploitation. The lives of enslaved women were not just commodities for trade, they were intricately tied to the political, economic, and social structures of the time. The power dynamics that allowed for the commodification of women extended beyond the markets where they were sold. They were woven into the fabric of everyday life, influencing how societies viewed gender roles, labor, and even human rights. In many ways, the idea of ownership and control in medieval society was deeply ingrained in the worldview of the time. Slavery was not just an economic tool, it was a social norm. The ruling class, including nobles and religious institutions, saw women as part of their property, whether they were free or enslaved. This created a structure in which women were constantly under the control of men, and their worth was measured not by their intelligence, abilities, or desires, but by their labor and reproductive capacities. This structure of control didn't only impact enslaved women, it affected all women. Even those who were not sold in markets were limited by societal expectations that defined them solely by their relationships to men. Whether as daughters, wives, or mothers, women had few opportunities to claim their own independence or assert control over their own lives. The system was so ingrained that it became normalized, and women's subjugation was seen as a natural state of affairs. The role of women in medieval society was essentially to serve the needs of men and the state. But despite this oppressive system, there were moments of resistance. Enslaved women found ways to assert their autonomy, even if it was just through small acts of defiance. In the most extreme cases, some women escaped slavery, fleeing to other regions or seeking refuge in cities where they could live without being controlled by their masters. These women, though few in number, demonstrated that resistance was possible even in a world that sought to silence them. Historians have often focused on the larger, more visible forms of rebellion in history, the uprisings, the revolts, the dramatic moments of resistance. But the everyday resistance of women who lived through slavery is just as significant. These women didn't always have the power to overthrow the system, but their survival in the face of unimaginable hardship was, in itself, an act of rebellion. The quiet resistance of enslaved women, whether through subtle manipulation, small acts of sabotage, or simply surviving another day, should be remembered as a vital part of the fight for freedom. The struggle for women's autonomy and equality is not confined to the past. The systems that allowed for the exploitation of women in the medieval period have evolved, but they have not disappeared. The commodification of women's bodies, particularly through modern-day slavery and human trafficking, reflects the same patriarchal systems of control that existed centuries ago. Today, women are still being bought, sold, and exploited in various forms, whether in the sex trade, forced labor, or domestic servitude. The fight for women's rights, dignity, and freedom continues, and the lessons learned from the history of enslaved women are just as relevant now as they were in the past. These women, whose lives were marked by suffering and exploitation, have left behind a legacy that is not one of defeat, but of resistance and survival. Their ability to endure, to fight back in whatever small ways they could, demonstrates the resilience of the human spirit. Their story is a reminder that even when the odds seem insurmountable, there is always room for hope, survival, and ultimately, change. As we look back on the lives of these women, it's impossible to ignore the psychological and emotional cost of medieval slavery. The daily toll it took on enslaved women wasn't just physical, it also left deep psychological scars. The dehumanization they experienced wasn't only about being reduced to property, it was about being forced to live without the basic human rights of autonomy, freedom, and dignity. Enslaved women in medieval markets were subjected to a lifetime of fear, isolation, and violence, and the emotional toll of this system was just as damaging as the physical. Living under constant threat of being sold, separated from their families, or exploited for labor and reproduction, the mental strain these women endured is unimaginable. They were not only forced to work and produce, they were stripped of their identity, their autonomy, and their connection to their own futures. When your body is not your own, when your life is entirely controlled by another person, the emotional damage is immense. The deep-seated trauma created by this systematic control would have had far-reaching effects not just in the lives of these women, but in the generations that followed them. Psychologically, this kind of treatment leads to the breakdown of self-worth. When your entire existence is defined by what you can do for others, when you are seen as less than human, it becomes incredibly difficult to maintain a sense of individuality. For many of these women, their sense of self was entirely tied to their ability to serve their masters. In a society where women had little to no agency, where their worth was determined by their ability to produce labor and children, the internalized effects of this dehumanization would have been profound. Some women may have been able to resist the psychological effects of this exploitation, finding moments of autonomy within the confines of their oppressive circumstances. They might have fought back mentally, holding on to memories of better times or dreams of freedom. But for many others, the damage was too great. The fear of punishment, the loss of family, and the constant reminder of their worthlessness could have broken their spirits. These women weren't just physically enslaved, they were psychologically enslaved, trapped in a world that saw them as less than human. This psychological aspect of slavery is something that's often overlooked. We tend to focus on the physical violence, the beatings, the abuse, but the emotional and mental abuse was just as pervasive. The isolation, the loss of identity, and the constant threat of violence created an environment where enslaved women had little hope of ever escaping the system. Even if they did manage to escape, the emotional scars would have remained. For many, the trauma of their enslavement would have followed them for the rest of their lives, influencing their sense of self-worth and their ability to form meaningful relationships. It's important to recognize that the effects of this psychological trauma didn't just disappear once the practice of slavery was abolished. The damage caused by centuries of dehumanization left deep scars on the collective psyche of societies that had built their economies on the exploitation of others. The mental and emotional wounds carried by those who survived slavery were passed down to future generations, continuing to affect the way women were viewed and treated in the centuries to come. Today, we still see the echoes of this trauma. The commodification of women's bodies, whether through human trafficking, forced labor, or the media's objectification of women, continues to perpetuate a cycle of dehumanization. The psychological impact of this treatment is profound, and it shapes the way women view themselves and the way they are viewed by society. While much has been done to combat these injustices, the emotional scars of centuries of oppression continue to affect the way women are treated today. The fight for equality, for the end of human trafficking, and for the recognition of women's humanity is not just about changing laws or policies, it's about changing the way society views women. The psychological impact of centuries of exploitation and objectification cannot be ignored. To truly create a world where women are free from violence and exploitation, we must acknowledge the lasting emotional and psychological toll that these systems of control have left behind. The women whose lives were sold in medieval markets endured unimaginable suffering, but they also demonstrated an incredible level of resilience. Their survival, their ability to find moments of resistance, and their will to keep going in the face of systemic violence is a testament to the strength of the human spirit. We must honor their legacy by continuing the work of breaking down the psychological and societal barriers that still perpetuate gender inequality and exploitation today. As we explore the complexities of medieval slavery and the continued impact on women, it becomes clear that the system of control wasn't just about ownership, it was about the complete erasure of women's autonomy. The women who found themselves in medieval slave markets were not just stripped of their material rights, they were stripped of their identities, their futures, and their inherent dignity. This system of subjugation was designed to control not only their bodies, but also their minds. The psychological effects of being reduced to property were profound, and these women were made to feel that they had no purpose beyond serving the needs of others. In a world where your worth is defined solely by your ability to serve, whether through labor or reproduction, how do you hold on to your sense of self? The system forced women to live under constant surveillance, devoid of any real control over their lives. They were sold, traded, and forced into roles dictated entirely by others, often with little hope of ever escaping the cycle. The very idea of freedom of self-determination was a concept beyond their reach. Their lives were shaped by the whims of their masters, and this took a deep toll on their psychological well-being. The trauma they experienced went far beyond the physical beatings or the grueling labor. The emotional strain of knowing that their children would suffer the same fate, of constantly living with the fear of being sold or separated from loved ones, was enough to break the spirit of many. These women were not just laborers, they were mothers, daughters, and individuals with dreams and desires. Yet their humanity was systematically erased in a society that saw them as nothing more than tools for reproduction and labor. What's even more disturbing is how normalized this dehumanization became. The commodification of women's bodies wasn't just accepted, it was institutionalized. Medieval society, particularly under the feudal system, created a structure where women, especially those of lower social status or enslaved, had very little value except for their labor and reproductive capabilities. In this context, they were not seen as individuals with rights, but as mere extensions of their master's wealth and power. The system perpetuated a cycle where women were continuously reduced to their most basic functions, and their emotional, intellectual, and personal needs were disregarded entirely. What's equally troubling is that this view of women as property wasn't just confined to the feudal lords, the wealthy, or the church. It was part of the broader cultural mindset. Social norms reinforced the idea that women were not to be valued as equals, but as possessions, whether in marriage, in the home, or in the marketplace. These deeply entrenched ideas continue to influence the way women are treated in many parts of the world today. While the form of medieval slavery has long been abolished, the underlying belief that women's bodies and labor are not their own remains a persistent issue. This is not just a historical issue, it's one that continues to shape gender relations in the modern world. From human trafficking to the objectification of women in the media, the basic human right to control one's body and to live free from exploitation is still being denied to women around the world. This is why the fight for gender equality is not just about legal reform, it's about changing the cultural, economic, and societal systems that perpetuate these patterns of control and dehumanization. The women who lived through medieval slavery may have been silenced by history, but their suffering, their endurance, and their resistance continue to inform the fight for freedom and equality today. Looking at the past gives us a clearer understanding of how far we've come and how much further we need to go. The abolition of slavery may have removed the formal structures that commodified women in medieval markets, but it did not eliminate the deeply rooted societal attitudes that saw women as inferior. The work to change these attitudes continues, and the lessons learned from the lives of these enslaved women can guide us in the ongoing struggle for gender equality. As we move forward, we must keep their legacy alive by continuing to fight for a world where women are free from exploitation, free from control, and free to define their own futures. Now that we've explored the societal structures that perpetuated the enslavement of women in medieval times, it's essential to understand how the intersections of class, race, and gender played a role in this system. The commodification of women wasn't only about their biological functions, it was also about power dynamics that crossed social, political, and economic boundaries. The way women were treated in medieval slave markets wasn't just about being born into a certain class or status. It was about the ways those classes were structured around the ownership and control of women's bodies. Medieval society was starkly divided along class lines, with the elite controlling much of the land, wealth, and power, while the lower classes comprising peasants, servants, and enslaved individuals were left to struggle for basic survival. For women, this meant being doubly oppressed, once by their class and again by their gender. For enslaved women, the intersection of these two forms of oppression was overwhelming. Their social status as women was already seen as inferior, but when combined with the brutal realities of slavery, it made them among the most vulnerable members of society. Enslaved women in the medieval markets didn't only face exploitation from their male masters, they were often also subject to the whims of other women in the household, including wives or daughters of wealthy lords. Though women of the upper classes were themselves subjugated by patriarchal norms, they had power over enslaved women in ways that were perhaps less physically direct, but no less damaging. Women in positions of power over enslaved women perpetuated the same system of control, viewing them as property, as tools to be used, and not as individuals with rights. Racial dynamics, though less emphasized in medieval European contexts than in later periods, were still a factor in shaping who was more likely to be enslaved. People of different ethnic backgrounds were often viewed as other or inferior in the medieval world. The expansion of European powers into different regions brought new opportunities for enslaving people, particularly in the context of the Crusades and the expansion of trade routes. While much of medieval slavery involved people from within Europe, particularly Eastern Europe, the presence of African and Arab slaves also became more prominent with the growth of transcontinental trade. These racial and ethnic distinctions further complicated the experiences of enslaved women, marking them not only as women, but also as belonging to a marginalized racial or ethnic group. As we look at the legacy of these systems of oppression, it becomes clear that they have not disappeared. Just as racial inequality and class stratification continue to affect the global system today, the exploitation of women in modern forms of slavery, human trafficking, forced domestic labor, and sexual exploitation often follows similar patterns of class, race, and gender oppression. Though slavery in the traditional medieval sense has been formally abolished, many women still find themselves trapped in systems that commodify their bodies, reduce their value to their ability to labor or produce children, and strip away their basic human rights. In modern times, women from marginalized racial, ethnic, and economic backgrounds are more likely to become victims of human trafficking and forced labor. These women are often preyed upon because of their perceived vulnerability, their poverty, their lack of access to education or resources, and their isolation within certain social or racial groups. The parallels between the medieval treatment of enslaved women and the exploitation of women today are striking. They remind us that the fight against human trafficking, gender inequality, and economic exploitation is not just about fighting for legal rights, but about dismantling the systems that perpetuate these cycles of oppression. Historians have often debated how much medieval slavery influenced later forms of oppression, but regardless of whether it served as a direct blueprint for modern systems of control, the underlying themes of racial, class, and gender-based exploitation remain remarkably consistent. The systems that dehumanized women in the medieval era laid the groundwork for the ways in which women continue to be seen and treated as property in the modern world. As long as these systems persist, the work of those fighting for women's equality and autonomy remains as urgent as ever. By acknowledging the ways in which class, race, and gender intersected to perpetuate the oppression of enslaved women in medieval markets, we gain a clearer understanding of the complex ways these same dynamics continue to affect women around the world today. The struggle for gender equality is not only about breaking down the barriers of patriarchal control, it's about confronting the global structures of inequality that maintain these systems of oppression and finding ways to dismantle them, once and for all. As we continue to unravel the impact of medieval slavery, it's important to explore the religious and ideological frameworks that reinforced the system. The medieval period was not just an era of political and economic control, but also one of profound religious influence. The Church played a central role in shaping attitudes toward women and slavery, often acting as both a moral guide and a stabilizing force for the social hierarchies of the time. In many ways, the Church was complicit in the perpetuation of these oppressive systems, offering theological justifications for the exploitation of women and the broader practice of slavery. Religious doctrines during the medieval period reinforced the idea of women's subordination. Christian teachings, which were central to the medieval worldview, often portrayed women as inherently inferior to men. Eve, according to biblical interpretation, was the one who brought sin into the world, and thus women were viewed as more susceptible to temptation and sin. This created an ideological foundation for the control of women, as religious figures taught that women were not to be trusted with power or independence. In a world shaped by these beliefs, the idea of enslaving women, particularly for reproductive labor or domestic service, was easily justified. Women's bodies were viewed as sites for male domination, whether within the home or on a broader, more institutionalized scale. Interestingly, the Church didn't oppose slavery outright. While some religious figures spoke against the harsh treatment of slaves, the Church as an institution rarely took action to end the practice of slavery. In fact, many religious leaders saw slavery as an integral part of the social and economic order. The Church's teachings, which emphasized obedience and submission, were often applied to enslaved women, reinforcing their role as subservient to male authority both in their homes and in the broader feudal structure. This created a moral framework that allowed the oppression of women to be accepted by both the powerful and the oppressed, further cementing the status quo. Religious justifications for the treatment of enslaved women weren't always explicit, but they were deeply embedded in the structures of medieval society. By framing women as inferior to men in spiritual, moral, and intellectual capacities, religious leaders legitimized their subjugation. Even women who were not enslaved found their roles in society limited by these beliefs. They were often seen not as autonomous individuals with rights, but as extensions of their husbands or fathers, subject to the same systems of control and ownership. This ideological framework did not just affect women who were enslaved, it shaped the very fabric of medieval gender relations. The idea that women were inherently subordinate to men helped to maintain a system in which women's value was primarily tied to their ability to serve the needs of men, whether through marriage, reproduction, or labor. These religious and cultural beliefs created a situation where women's humanity was often overlooked or denied, and their subjugation was seen as a natural part of the social order. Today, we see the echoes of these medieval religious views in many modern systems of oppression. The idea that women are somehow lesser than men continues to persist in various forms, from cultural attitudes to religious teachings. While many religions have evolved in their views on gender equality, there are still parts of the world where women are denied basic rights based on religious doctrines. The continued justification for the subjugation of women, whether in the form of restricted rights, violence, or trafficking, reflects the deeply ingrained beliefs that have been passed down through generations. In considering the religious and ideological frameworks that supported medieval slavery, we must acknowledge the power of belief systems in shaping social norms and power dynamics. The religious views that perpetuated women's subjugation in medieval slavery are not a distant relic. They continue to shape attitudes toward women today. The struggle for women's rights is not only a fight against economic and political systems, but also a fight against the harmful religious ideologies that still seek to limit women's autonomy and control their bodies. As we move forward, it is essential to continue challenging these outdated and harmful beliefs, not only through legal reforms but through cultural and religious shifts. By addressing the ways in which religion and ideology have historically supported the oppression of women, we can begin to dismantle the deeply ingrained systems of control that continue to affect women worldwide. As we delve further into the historical context of medieval slavery and its profound impact on women, we cannot ignore the importance of solidarity and support systems among enslaved individuals. While the systems of power and control in medieval society were overwhelmingly stacked against enslaved women, many of them found ways to survive through connections with others, whether they were other enslaved women or free women, who could offer them some measure of support. These alliances, though often small and frail, were critical in providing enslaved women with moments of resistance and hope. One of the most powerful forms of solidarity came from the relationships enslaved women formed with one another. Though they were often divided by their masters and subjected to the harshest treatment, the shared experience of oppression created a bond that allowed these women to support each other in ways that were, at times, subtle but immensely important. They could share strategies for coping with their circumstances, provide emotional support, and even form covert networks of escape or protection. These relationships were not just about survival, they were a form of resistance. The simple act of supporting each other in a world that tried to strip them of everything: identity, hope, freedom, was an act of defiance. In some cases, enslaved women would form bonds with free women or sympathetic individuals outside the slave system. This could take the form of friendships, mutual aid, or even attempts to secure freedom or safety through alliances. However, the dangers of such relationships were immense, as these women risked punishment, abuse, or even death if they were caught aiding an enslaved person. Nonetheless, these alliances served as lifelines for many enslaved women, offering them a glimmer of hope in a world dominated by fear and control. One particularly poignant form of solidarity occurred within the family unit. While many enslaved women were forcibly separated from their families through the slave market, there were instances where family bonds were maintained and even strengthened. Mothers would protect their children with every ounce of strength they had, and in some cases, entire families were able to create small pockets of resistance. A mother's love for her child was a powerful motivator to find ways to survive, to escape, or to secure better treatment. Even within the harshest of circumstances, these familial bonds remained a source of resistance, survival, and dignity. The idea that these women could resist not only for themselves but for their loved ones added an extra layer of strength to their fight for freedom. The presence of solidarity and resistance, even in small, seemingly insignificant ways, is a testament to the strength and resilience of enslaved women. While these small acts of defiance may not have immediately overthrown the system, they were critical in maintaining the human spirit in the face of overwhelming odds. The survival of these women, The way they resisted the attempts to strip away their humanity is an example of the unbreakable strength of the human soul, even when faced with an entire system designed to crush it. In modern times, the legacy of solidarity and resistance continues to inspire movements for women's rights, for racial justice, and for the abolition of human trafficking and slavery. The fight for freedom and equality is not simply about legal reform. It is about the creation of a supportive network of people who can offer help, solidarity, and a sense of shared humanity. This fight for solidarity in the modern world mirrors the quiet rebellions of medieval women who fought to survive, not just for themselves, but for their families, communities, and future generations. The struggle of enslaved women in medieval times is not just about their suffering, it's about their survival, and the solidarity that allowed them to resist. We must remember these women, not just for the hardships they endured, but for their resilience, for the connections they formed, and for the small acts of rebellion that helped preserve their humanity. Today, we continue their fight for justice, equality, and freedom, and we carry their legacy of solidarity with us in our ongoing struggle against the systems of oppression that still affect women and marginalized communities around the world. As we approach the final section of our exploration into the lives of medieval enslaved women, it's vital to reflect on the broader implications of their stories. The historical suffering of these women is often buried beneath centuries of silence, but their resilience and resistance have endured in ways we may not immediately recognize. Their struggles were not just against the forces of their time, they were part of a much broader, global history of exploitation, resistance, and ultimately, transformation. In medieval markets, women were bought, sold, and subjected to the whims of those in power. Yet, despite this brutal subjugation, the spirit of these women, of their survival, their endurance, and their moments of rebellion left a mark on history. Their stories are not only about the cruelty they faced, they are also about the quiet revolutions they sparked, whether in the form of subtle defiance or the bonds they formed with others in similar circumstances. These women's refusal to be erased by the systems that sought to strip them of their dignity became an enduring testament to the power of the human spirit. The resilience of these women challenges us to think about the nature of resistance. It was not always loud or visible, but it was no less meaningful. The act of survival itself became a form of resistance, and the moments of solidarity between women, whether within families or across boundaries of slavery and freedom, demonstrated a profound strength that transcended their immediate circumstances. These women may not have had the power to dismantle the system in their lifetimes, but they helped lay the foundation for future struggles for freedom, equality, and justice. As we look at the world today, we see echoes of these same struggles. The systems of oppression that once commodified women in medieval slave markets have evolved, but the exploitation of women's bodies, labor, and identities is still prevalent in modern forms of slavery and trafficking. The fight for women's rights is ongoing, but the foundation of that fight has been shaped by the bravery of those who endured in silence, who resisted through their survival, and who fought for a future beyond their suffering. The legacy of these women is one of empowerment. They showed us that even when the odds are overwhelmingly against you, there is always room for hope, resistance, and transformation. Their stories remind us that the systems that perpetuate injustice are not invincible. They can be challenged, they can be dismantled, and they can be replaced with systems that recognize the inherent dignity of every human being, regardless of their gender, race, or social status. In closing, it is important to acknowledge that the work is far from over. While we've made strides in the fight for women's rights, the battle against human trafficking, exploitation, and gender inequality is ongoing. As we move forward, let us carry the legacy of these women with us. Let us remember their struggles, their strength, and their unwavering belief in their own humanity. The fight for justice is not just about the past. It is about ensuring that future generations of women are never again reduced to objects to be bought and sold. We must continue to resist the systems of oppression, continue to build solidarity, and continue to fight for a world where every woman is free to live with dignity, autonomy, and equality. Finally, as we reflect on the incredible resilience of these women, let us recognize the power of solidarity, hope, and resistance in our own time. Their stories are a call to action, a reminder that, despite the forces that seek to dehumanize us, there is always strength in survival, and always power in the pursuit of freedom.